The stagecoach door swung open, and Martha Ellison's world tilted on its axis. A stranger stepped onto her dusty prairie land, holding a worn letter in his weathered hands, her own handwriting staring back at her like a ghost from a winter she'd tried to forget. "I'm Samuel Grant, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "I've come to marry you." But Martha had no memory of summoning a husband. None at all. What happened next would change everything she thought she knew about second chances, divine timing, and the courage it takes to trust again. If you're watching from your corner of the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because what you're about to hear is a tale of loneliness transformed, promises forgotten and fulfilled, and love that bloomed from the ashes of despair. The prairie stretched, endless and unforgiving beneath the vast Montana sky, a sea of golden grass that rippled like water under the relentless wind. It was late September in the year 1885, and the sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. Martha Ellison stood beside her weathered fence line, hammer in hand, sweat dampening the collar of her faded calico dress. Her dark hair, streaked prematurely with silver, had escaped its pins and whipped across her face as she wrestled with a stubborn fence post that refused to stay upright. She was 32 years old, though the last 2 years had carved lines around her eyes that made her look older. 2 years since the fever came. 2 years since she'd buried her husband Thomas in the small cemetery on the hill beneath the cottonwood tree where they'd first kissed as newlyweds. 2 years of working this land alone, of eating supper in silence, of lying awake at night listening to the emptiness echo through the rooms of their small farmhouse. The fence post tilted again, mocking her efforts. Martha bit back a word her mother would have scolded her for and raised the hammer once more. The blister on her palm had broken open an hour ago, and blood mixed with dirt on the handle, but she couldn't afford to stop. Winter was coming, and if the cattle got loose again, she'd lose what little she had left. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the approach of wheels on the dirt road, didn't notice the dust cloud rising in the distance, or the way her chickens scattered toward the barn. It wasn't until her dog, an old sheepdog named Rufus, began barking that she looked up and felt her heart skip a beat. A stagecoach was coming down her lane. Martha dropped the hammer and stared. In the 2 years since Thomas died, she'd had exactly 3 visitors: the circuit preacher who came twice yearly, old Mrs. Henderson who'd brought a casserole after the funeral, and the tax collector who'd threatened to take her land if she couldn't pay. Stagecoaches didn't come to her farm. They passed by on the main road 2 miles south, carrying travelers between Fort Benton and Helena, people with destinations and purposes that had nothing to do with her quiet corner of loneliness. But this coach had turned onto her property, was rolling steadily closer, pulled by 4 horses whose hooves kicked up clouds of Montana dust. Martha's hands moved automatically to her hair, trying to tuck the wild strands back into some semblance of order. She wiped her palms on her apron, wincing as the fabric caught on her broken blister. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had someone died? Was there news from back east? From the sister she hadn't seen in 10 years? Had the bank finally come to take what she couldn't afford to lose? The coach came to a stop 30 feet from where she stood. The driver, a grizzled man she didn't recognize, gave her a brief nod but said nothing. He simply climbed down from his perch, walked to the coach door, and opened it with the practiced deficiency of someone who'd performed this action 10,000 times before. A man stepped out. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor and a frame that hadn't yet been bent by hardship, though there was something in his bearing that suggested he'd known his share of it. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar, and a face that was weathered but not unkind. He wore a simple brown suit that had seen better days, the kind a working man might own for church and funerals, and he carried a single battered suitcase that looked as though it had traveled halfway across the continent. His eyes found hers immediately. Steady, gray-blue eyes that held something Martha couldn't quite name. Uncertainty, perhaps. Hope. A touch of apprehension. He removed his hat, revealing more of that sun-lightened hair, and took a step toward her. His boots were dusty from travel, and she noticed he moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them, touched with an accent she couldn't quite place. Somewhere from the east, she thought. Perhaps Pennsylvania or Ohio. Would you be Martha Ellison? The sound of her name in this stranger's mouth sent a chill down her spine despite the September heat. I am, she said, her voice coming out stronger than she felt. Years of farm work had taught her not to show weakness, even when her insides were trembling. And who might you be? The man's expression shifted, relief mixed with something else. He set down his suitcase and reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a folded piece of paper that looked worn from handling. My name is Samuel Grant, ma'am, he said, taking another step closer. Rufus growled low in his throat, but Martha placed a hand on the dog's head, quieting him. I received your letter. I've come. That is, I'm here because you sent for me. Martha's blood turned to ice water in her veins. My letter? The words came out barely above a whisper. I didn't send any letter, Mr. Grant. You must be mistaken. But even as she spoke, something flickered at the edges of her memory, something dark and desperate and better left buried. Samuel's face fell, confusion replacing the hopeful uncertainty. Ma'am, I have it right here. You wrote to the Western Matrimonial Agency in Chicago. 6 months ago, March of this year. You described your situation, a widow with a farm in Montana Territory, seeking a God-fearing man for companionship and partnership. He held out the paper to her with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Martha didn't want to take it. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to send this man away, to pretend she had no idea what he was talking about. But her feet carried her forward of their own accord, her hand reaching out, her fingers closing around paper that felt both foreign and terrifyingly familiar. She unfolded it slowly, and her own handwriting stared back at her like an accusation. Dear Sir, my name is Martha Ellison, and I am writing in desperate hope that the Lord might use your service to answer the prayers of a lonely widow. The words blurred as memory came crashing back like a wave that had been held at bay too long. It had been winter, February perhaps, or early March. The worst winter she could remember, with snow piled so high against the house that she'd had to tunnel out each morning just to reach the barn. She'd been snowed in for 3 weeks, completely alone, with nothing but her thoughts and the howling wind for company. The loneliness had been a physical thing, a weight pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She'd been sitting at Thomas's old desk, going through papers she probably shouldn't have been reading, old letters from before they were married, reminders of what it felt like to be anticipated, to be wanted. At the bottom of the drawer, she'd found a newspaper someone had left behind, months old, already yellowed at the edges. The advertisement had been small, tucked between notices for patent medicines and farmland for sale. Western Matrimonial Agency, connecting respectable men and women across the frontier. Correspondence is facilitated in strictest confidence. She'd stared at it for hours, telling herself she was being foolish. But the wind had howled and the silence had screamed, and somewhere around midnight, with tears freezing on her cheeks, she'd taken out pen and paper and written a letter. She had no business writing. She'd described herself honestly, a widow of 29. She'd lied about her age by 3 years. With a modest farm and no children, seeking an honest Christian man who knew the value of hard work and wasn't afraid of the challenges of frontier life. She'd written about Thomas, about how much she'd loved him, about how the loneliness was killing her just as surely as the fever had killed him. And then she'd walked 2 miles through the snow to the postal station and sent it before she could change her mind. The next morning, she'd woken with such crushing regret that she'd physically been sick. What had she done? What kind of desperate, shameful woman advertised for a husband like a mail-order bride? She'd tried to convince herself the letter would never be answered, that it would get lost somewhere between Montana and Chicago, that the agency probably wasn't even real. As weeks turned to months and spring arrived, she'd managed to push it from her mind entirely, buried it so deep that it became like something that happened to someone else in another life. Until now. "Oh God," Martha whispered, the letter trembling in her hands. "Oh dear God, I forgot." Samuel stood very still, watching her face change as recognition and horror dawned. Behind him, the stagecoach driver cleared his throat. "You want I should wait, mister?" the driver asked. "Or are you getting back in?" There was a long, terrible pause. Martha could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the wind moving through the grass, could hear everything and nothing all at once. Samuel didn't take his eyes off her face. "I'll need you to take my trunk off the back," he said quietly. "I'll be staying." "Samuel, Mr. Grant." Martha found her voice, though it cracked on his name. "I can't. This is a mistake. I shouldn't have. I didn't mean—" "The letter says different, ma'am," he said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only a bone-deep weariness. "You wrote that you were ready for a new beginning, that you believed God might have someone out there for you, that you were willing to take a leap of faith." "I was out of my mind with loneliness." The words burst out of her, sharp and raw. "It was the dead of winter, and I'd been alone for weeks, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I never expected— I didn't think anyone would actually come," Samuel finished for her. His smile was sad. "But I did, Mrs. Ellison. I sold my workshop, sold everything I owned, used every penny I had to pay the agency fee, buy the train ticket, the stagecoach fare. I traveled 2,000 miles because your letter gave me hope that maybe, after everything, I could have a life again." The driver had retrieved a large trunk from the back of the coach and set it in the dust beside Samuel's suitcase. "That'll be all then?" he asked. Samuel nodded. "That's all. Thank you." The driver climbed back onto his perch, tipped his hat to Martha, though his expression held a mixture of pity and judgment that made her face burn, and snapped the reins. The coach turned in a wide circle and rolled back down the lane, leaving them standing in the settling dust. Silence fell between them, heavy and horrible. Martha's mind spun in circles, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. She couldn't possibly let this man stay. It was improper, impossible, insane. But she also couldn't send him away. He just said he'd sold everything. Where would he go? What would he do? And beneath the panic and the shame, a small, traitorous part of her heart whispered, "You wanted this. You prayed for this. And here he is." "I can't marry you," she said finally, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Grant. I truly am, but I can't. I'm not ready. I may never be ready." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, disappointment giving way to resignation, resignation giving way to a quiet dignity that made her throat ache. "I understand," he said softly. He bent to pick up his suitcase, wincing slightly as he did so. That left leg again. "I'll walk to town. Is there a hotel or a boarding house where a man might find work?" "Town's 8 miles east," Martha heard herself say, "and there's no work there. The mine closed last year. Most folks have moved on." "I see." He straightened, case in hand, and looked around at the prairie stretching in every direction. The sun was lower now, would be setting within a few hours. "Well then, I suppose I'd better start walking." He took 3 steps before Martha's conscience, and something else, something she wasn't ready to name, made her call out, "Wait." He stopped, turning back to face her. Martha looked at this stranger who wasn't quite a stranger, this man who'd crossed half a continent because of words she'd written in a moment of desperate weakness. She looked at his worn suit and his tired eyes and the way he held himself with dignity despite the fact that his entire world had just collapsed around him. She thought about the bunkhouse, the small structure Thomas had built the year before he died, when they'd hoped to hire seasonal help for planting and harvest. It had a stove, a bed, 4 solid walls. It had sat empty since Thomas passed, gathering dust and mice. She thought about the fence post lying in the dirt, about the barn roof that leaked, about the 1,000 tasks she couldn't manage alone, about eating supper in silence, about the long winter coming, about loneliness that felt like drowning. "There's a bunkhouse," she said, the words coming out stiff and formal. "Behind the barn. It's small, but it's weatherproof. You can stay there." Hope flickered in Samuel's eyes, quickly dampened by caution. "I wouldn't want to impose—" "You'll work for your keep," Martha continued, her voice growing stronger as a plan formed. "I need help with the farm, repairs mostly. Heavy labor I can't manage on my own. I'll provide meals and shelter. In return, you work. That's the arrangement, nothing more." "Nothing more," Samuel echoed, and she couldn't tell if it was agreement or sadness. "And when you've saved enough money to move on, to start over somewhere else, you're free to go. No obligations, no promises." "No promises," he repeated. They stood there in the fading light, two broken people trying to negotiate the terms of survival. "Do we have an agreement, Mr. Grant?" Martha asked. Samuel set down his suitcase and extended his hand. "We do, Mrs. Ellison." She hesitated only a moment before taking it. His palm was calloused, his grip firm but gentle. The handshake lasted exactly as long as propriety demanded, and not a second more. "I'll show you to the bunkhouse," she said, releasing his hand and turning toward the barn. "You'll want to get settled before dark." Samuel collected his trunk and suitcase and followed her across the yard. Rufus trailed behind, still suspicious but no longer growling. The bunkhouse was exactly as she'd described. Small, weatherproof, and covered in 2 years' worth of dust and neglect. A simple iron bed frame stood against one wall, stripped of its mattress. A pot-bellied stove occupied one corner, and a rough wooden table with a single chair sat beneath the window. Shelves lined another wall, empty except for a few rusted tools and a Bible so old its cover had separated from its spine. "It's not much," Martha said, suddenly seeing the space through a stranger's eyes and feeling ashamed of its bareness. "It's more than I had this morning," Samuel replied. "This morning I woke up in a boarding house in Helena, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Now I have a roof over my head and honest work ahead of me. I'd say that's something to be grateful for." His words, so simple and sincere, made Martha's throat tighten. "There's a mattress in the house," she said, keeping her voice businesslike. "I'll bring it out, along with blankets, and I can fetch it, if you'll tell me where it is." Samuel interrupted gently. "No need for you to do the heavy carrying. It's in the storage room off the kitchen, second door on the right. And there's a pump behind the barn if you need water." Samuel nodded. "I'll get cleaned up and bring the mattress out. What time is supper?" 6 o'clock. Kitchen's at the back of the house. Door's usually unlocked." Another nod. Then, as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Mrs. Ellison?" She looked back. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not sending me away empty-handed, for giving me a chance to earn my way. That's more kindness than I had any right to expect." Martha didn't know what to say to that, so she simply nodded and left, her boots crunching on the dirt path back to the house. Once inside, she leaned against the closed door, her heart pounding. What had she done? She'd just invited a strange man, a man who'd come here expecting to marry her, to live on her property, to work beside her day after day, to share meals across her table. It was madness. It was dangerous. It was improper. It was also, a small voice whispered, the first time in 2 years that the house didn't feel quite so empty. Through the kitchen window, she watched Samuel emerge from the house carrying the heavy mattress, as though it weighed nothing. He maneuvered it through the bunkhouse door with practiced efficiency, then disappeared inside. A few minutes later, smoke began rising from the bunkhouse chimney as he got the stove going. Martha turned away and began preparing supper with mechanical movements, slicing salt pork, setting beans to boil, mixing up cornbread. Her hands knew the work so well she didn't have to think about it, which was good because her mind was spinning in 100 different directions. She kept coming back to the letter, to her own handwriting spelling out her loneliness for a stranger to read. "I wake up each morning wondering what the point of another day might be," she'd written. "The farm needs me, I suppose, but I wonder sometimes if that's enough. If surviving is the same as living." Had she really been that desperate? That broken? Yes, her memory answered. Yes, you were. You... At precisely 6 o'clock, there was a soft knock on the kitchen door. Martha wiped her hands on her apron, smoothed her hair, and opened it. Samuel stood on the step, cleaned up as best he could with cold water from the pump. He'd changed into work clothes, simple dark trousers and a flannel shirt, and his hair was damp and combed back from his face. The dust of travel was gone, revealing a man who looked less like a desperate stranger and more like what he was, a skilled tradesman down on his luck, trying to make the best of an impossible situation. "Come in," Martha said, stepping aside. He entered carefully, as though aware he was crossing some invisible threshold. His eyes took in the kitchen, the simple table set for two, the cast-iron stove, the shelves lined with preserves she'd put up herself, the photographs on the wall. She saw him pause at one in particular, her wedding portrait, Thomas standing tall and proud beside her younger, happier self. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. Yes, Thomas Ellison. He passed 2 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. The exchange was formal, stilted, the words people said because they were expected. But there was something in Samuel's tone, a genuine understanding, that suggested he knew what loss felt like. They sat down to eat in silence that stretched uncomfortably between them. Martha found herself hyper-aware of every sound: the scrape of forks on plates, the creak of Samuel's chair, the ticking of the clock on the mantel. She snuck glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking, noticing details: the way he ate slowly, deliberately, as though savoring food he hadn't been certain he'd have; the scar that ran along the back of his right hand, the way he favored that left leg even while sitting. Finally, unable to bear the quiet any longer, she spoke. You said you sold your workshop. What kind of work did you do? Samuel looked up, seeming almost surprised that she'd asked. I was a carpenter, had a shop in Cleveland, Ohio, made furniture mostly, tables, chairs, cabinets, did some finish work for the bigger houses in town. What made you leave? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My wife died in childbirth 3 years ago. Lost the baby too. A son. After that, I couldn't seem to find my footing. The work felt empty. The town felt empty. When I saw your letter, when I read about a woman who understood what it meant to lose everything and still wake up the next morning, I thought— He paused, setting down his fork. I thought maybe two people who'd both walked through fire might understand each other better than most. Martha felt something crack in her chest, a tiny fissure in the wall she'd built around her grief. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. About your wife and son. Catherine, he said softly. Her name was Catherine. And the boy, we were going to call him James, after my father. Catherine and James, Martha repeated, honoring them with names instead of just sorrow. I'm sure they were dearly loved. They were. They are. He met her eyes. Just as I'm sure your Thomas was. He was. He is. They understood each other then, in a way that needed no further words. They were both haunted, both carrying ghosts, both trying to figure out how to live in a world that had taken the people who made life make sense. The rest of the meal passed in easier silence, the kind that exists between people who've recognized something in each other. When they'd finished, Samuel stood and began collecting the plates. You don't have to, Martha started. Fair's fair, he interrupted gently. You cooked, I'll clean. That's how my mother ran things, and it seemed to work well enough. He washed the dishes with the competent movements of someone who'd done it many times before, and Martha found herself studying him with new eyes. This wasn't a man who expected to be waited on. This was someone who understood partnership, who knew that survival on the frontier required both people to pull their weight. When the kitchen was clean, Samuel paused at the door. I'll be up before dawn, he said. If you could point me toward what needs doing most urgently, I'll make a start on it. Martha thought about the fence that refused to stand, the barn roof that leaked in 3 places, the stuck well pump that took 10 minutes of priming every morning. The fence along the southern pasture, she said. I've been fighting with it for 2 weeks. If you can get those posts set properly, that'd be a blessing. Consider it done. He tipped an imaginary hat. His real one was back in the bunkhouse, and stepped out into the night. Martha watched him cross the yard, his lantern bobbing in the darkness. She stood at the window longer than necessary, telling herself she was just making sure he made it safely, not admitting that the sight of light in the bunkhouse windows made the darkness feel less absolute. That night, she lay in bed listening to the prairie wind, but for the first time in 2 years, it didn't sound quite like loneliness. It sounded like something else. Possibility, perhaps. Or maybe just the smallest, most fragile seed of hope. True to his word, Samuel was up before dawn. Martha woke to the sound of someone working in the yard and stumbled to the window, still in her nightgown, to see him already at the fence line with her tools, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. She dressed quickly and went out to meet him, carrying 2 cups of coffee she'd hurriedly brewed. You didn't have to start this early, she said, handing him one of the cups. Habit, he replied, accepting it with a grateful nod. My father used to say the best work gets done before the heat of the day. Your father was a carpenter too? 5th generation. I learned the trade at his knee. was supposed to pass it on to my son." His voice caught almost imperceptibly on those last words. Martha understood. She'd had dreams too, of children running through these fields, of filling the empty bedrooms upstairs with laughter and noise. But fever had taken Thomas before those dreams could become real, and now, at 32, she had to accept that some futures simply weren't meant to be. They worked together as the sun climbed higher, and Martha was surprised by how easily they fell into rhythm. Samuel would call out instructions, "Hold this steady while I dig," and she'd comply without question. When he struggled to lift a particularly heavy post with his bad leg, she was there to help without being asked. They communicated more through gesture and intuition than words, each seeming to understand what the other needed. By midday, they'd reset 5 posts that had been defeated Martha for weeks. They stood strong and true, not even trembling when Samuel tested them with his full weight. "That should hold through winter," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But you'll want to check them after the spring thaw. Sometimes the ground shifts." "I'll remember that," Martha said. Then, because the words needed saying, "Thank you. I've been fighting this fence for so long I'd about given up on it." "Sometimes all we need is an extra pair of hands," Samuel said. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, and Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the September sun. She turned away, flustered. "I should get dinner started. And I should take a look at that barn roof you mentioned. Mind if I go up and assess the damage? Be careful. Some of those boards are rotted clean through." "I'll watch my step." Martha went back to the house, her mind churning with thoughts she wasn't ready to examine too closely. She told herself she was just grateful for the help, that it was practical to have a man around who could do the heavy work, that the strange fluttering in her chest when Samuel smiled at her was just relief at not having to shoulder every burden alone. But as she peeled potatoes and watched him through the window, moving across the barn roof with the confident grace of someone who'd spent his life working with heights and angles and the honest weight of wood, she admitted to herself that it might be more complicated than that. That evening at supper, Samuel was quieter than usual. He ate mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere, and Martha noticed him wincing when he shifted his weight. "Your leg is bothering you," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked up surprised. "It's nothing. Old injury." "From?" "The war. Took a piece of shrapnel at Cold Harbor. The Army surgeon wanted to take the leg, but I talked him out of it. Mostly I'm glad I did, but some days," he shrugged, "some days it reminds me that I'm not as young as I used to be." "You're not old," Martha said, then felt foolish for saying it. 36 last month, Samuel replied with a half smile. "Old enough to know better, too young to give up. That's what my mother would say." "Is she still living, your mother?" "No, passed 5 years ago, pneumonia. My father went a year later. I sometimes think he just couldn't bear to be without her." His voice softened. "They were married 42 years. He used to say she was the best decision he ever made." "That's a beautiful legacy," Martha said quietly. "It is, and a hard one to live up to." He pushed food around his plate. "Mrs. Ellison, I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer." Martha's stomach clenched. "All right. The letter you wrote, was any of it true, or was it all just loneliness talking?" She should have expected the question, but it still felt like a blow. Martha set down her fork carefully, buying time to formulate an answer. "It was all true," she said finally. "Every word. I was desperate and lonely, and so tired of waking up with nothing but emptiness ahead of me. I wanted companionship. I wanted partnership. I wanted—" She swallowed hard. "I wanted to feel like a person again instead of just a ghost haunting her own life." "And now?" Samuel asked. "Now that I'm here, now that this is real instead of just words on paper?" "Now I'm terrified," Martha admitted, "because wanting something in the dark of winter when you're half out of your mind is one thing, but having it show up on your doorstep with a face and a name and expectations, that's something else entirely. I don't know if I'm brave enough for this, Mr. Grant. I don't know if I'm ready." "I'm not asking you to be ready," Samuel said gently. "I'm not asking you for anything except honesty. If you truly want me gone, if this arrangement is causing you more pain than peace, tell me now. I'll figure something out. But if there's even a chance, even the smallest possibility, that this might be what we both need, then I'm asking you to give it time. Martha looked at this man who'd crossed a continent on the strength of her desperate words, who'd lost as much as she had, maybe more, who worked without complaint and washed dishes and treated her with a respect she'd almost forgotten she deserved. Time, she repeated. How much time? As much as you need. I'm not going anywhere, Mrs. Ellison, not unless you tell me to go. That night, Martha dreamed of Thomas for the first time in months. But instead of the nightmares she'd grown accustomed to, watching him die over and over, helpless to save him, this dream was different. They were standing in the field behind the house, the one where they'd planned to plant apple trees that never got planted. Thomas was smiling, that crooked smile she'd fallen in love with. You always were afraid of change, he said, not unkindly. Remember how long it took me to convince you to leave your parents' farm and come west with me? You were sure it would be a disaster. It almost was, Dream Martha replied. That first winter was so hard. But we made it through, Thomas said, together. That's what made the difference. Neither of us could have done it alone. I can't replace you, Martha whispered. I won't. I'm not asking you to, Thomas said, and his voice was so gentle it made her ache. But I'm not asking you to die with me either. You've got years ahead of you, Martha, years that should be filled with more than just survival, I'm afraid. I know, but you've always been braver than you believe. He reached out as if to touch her face, but his hand passed through her like smoke. Let yourself live, love. That's all I want for you. Let yourself live. She woke with tears on her cheeks, and the dream so vivid she could still feel the warmth of that phantom touch. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking, and through her window she could see smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney. Samuel was already awake, already preparing for another day of work. Martha rose and dressed, her heart heavy but somehow lighter too, as though she'd been carrying a weight she hadn't realized was there, and someone had helped shift it to a more bearable position. The days fell into a pattern. Samuel would rise before dawn and have coffee waiting when Martha emerged from the house. They'd work together through the morning, fixing, building, repairing all the things that had fallen into disrepair during her 2 years alone. At noon, they'd share a simple meal, usually eaten standing up or sitting on the porch steps. Afternoons brought more work, and evenings brought supper at the kitchen table, where their conversations gradually grew longer and more comfortable. Samuel fixed the barn roof, replaced 3 broken windows, rebuilt the chicken coop, and constructed a new gate for the south pasture. He worked with the quiet competence of someone who found satisfaction in a job well done, and he never complained, even when Martha could see the pain in his leg making him limp more heavily at day's end. For her part, Martha found herself looking forward to these shared meals, to the sound of another voice in the house. She noticed small things, how Samuel always hung his coat on the same peg, how he hummed while he worked, how he had a habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking through a problem. One evening, about 3 weeks after his arrival, Martha asked, "Why did you answer my letter specifically?" The agency must have had other women, other opportunities. Samuel considered the question as he helped her shell beans for the next day's supper. There were others, he admitted. Letters from women in California, Oregon, even one from Alaska, but yours was different. How? Most of the letters were practical, lists of what the woman had to offer, what she expected in return. Which is fine, marriage is practical. But yours... He paused, searching for words. Yours was honest about the hard parts. You didn't pretend to be something you weren't, didn't promise anything you couldn't deliver. You just laid out the truth. I'm broken, I'm struggling, and I'm looking for someone who understands that survival sometimes looks like barely holding on. That kind of honesty is rare. Or foolish, Martha said. No, brave. It takes courage to admit you can't do it all alone. He met her eyes. I wanted to meet the woman who could write those words. I wanted to know if someone who'd been through hell and come out the other side might have wisdom I needed. And have I? Martha asked quietly. Had that wisdom? Samuel smiled. You're still here, still fighting, still getting up every morning and doing what needs to be done. If that's not wisdom, I don't know what is. That night, as Martha prepared for bed, she found herself studying her reflection in the small mirror above her dresser. When had she last really looked at herself? The woman staring back was thinner than she'd been before Thomas died, with more lines around her eyes and mouth. But there was something else, too, something she hadn't seen in a long time, a spark of something that might, with enough care, grow into life again. A month after Samuel's arrival, the first snow fell. Martha woke to find the world transformed, everything softened and quieted under a blanket of white. Her first thought was dread. Winter had always been her enemy, the season of isolation and despair. But then she saw smoke rising from the bunkhouse and footprints in the snow leading to the barn, and she realized with a jolt that this winter would be different. When she went outside, she found that Samuel had already fed the livestock, broken ice in the water troughs, and was now chopping wood with steady, rhythmic strokes. "You should have waited," she called out. "I would have helped." He looked up, and the smile he gave her made something warm unfold in her chest. "I know you would have," he said, "but I also know you were up late last night mending my spare shirt. Figured you'd earned a few extra minutes of sleep." Martha hadn't thought he'd noticed. The shirt had been badly torn, probably caught on a nail while he was working on the barn, and she'd taken it upon herself to mend it. Just being neighborly, she'd told herself, the kind thing to do. But the way Samuel was looking at her now suggested he understood it was more than that darning someone's shirt at midnight was its own kind of language, its own kind of caring. The snow continued to fall, and as the days shortened and the temperature dropped, Martha and Samuel's lives became even more intertwined. He helped her process the last of the harvest, preserving vegetables and salting meat for the long months ahead. She taught him how to make soap from the lye and fat they'd been saving. They worked side by side in the cellar, organizing supplies, checking for rot, making sure they'd have enough to see them through until spring. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Samuel had started joining her in the main house after dark, both of them acknowledging without saying it that the cold made the bunkhouse less comfortable. He asked about the photographs on the mantel. Martha explained each one. Her parents, long dead now. Thomas's brother, who'd gone to California. Her sister in Boston, whom she hadn't seen since the wedding. "Do you miss them?" Samuel asked. "Your family?" "Every day," Martha admitted. "But out here, you learn that family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays." She didn't say the rest, that he had shown up, that he was staying, but the words hung in the air between them anyway. As November turned to December, something shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained began to narrow. Their conversations grew more personal. Their laughter came more easily. Samuel started calling her Martha instead of Mrs. Ellison, and she found herself thinking of him as Samuel instead of Mr. Grant. They were becoming friends. And maybe, Martha thought with equal parts terror and hope, something more. One night, during a particularly fierce blizzard that howled around the house like something alive, Samuel didn't return to the bunkhouse. It was too dangerous, they both agreed. He'd freeze before he made it across the yard. Instead, Martha made up a bed for him on the sofa in the front room, and they sat up late talking while the storm raged outside. "Tell me about Catherine," Martha said suddenly. She'd been wanting to ask for weeks but hadn't found the courage. "What was she like?" Samuel was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "She was sunshine," he said softly. "Always laughing, always finding joy in the smallest things. She could make friends with anyone, shopkeepers, children, stray dogs. Everyone loved her." He smiled at the memory. "I used to wonder what she saw in me. I was serious, practical, not given to flights of fancy. But she said that's what she needed, someone to anchor her when her head got too far into the clouds." "You must miss her terribly." "I do, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The pain isn't as sharp as it used to be. Time doesn't heal, not exactly, but it does change things. Makes the grief something you can carry instead of something that carries you." "Yes," Martha breathed. "Exactly that." Their eyes met across the firelit room, and in that moment they understood each other completely. Two people who'd been broken by loss, learning slowly how to be whole again. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel said. "Anything." "The letter. When you wrote it, what did you hope would happen? In your most secret heart, what did you actually want?" Martha drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, thinking. "I wanted not to be alone anymore," she said finally. "Not just physically. I could have hired farmhands for that, but alone in the ways that matter. I wanted someone to talk to at the end of the day. Someone who'd notice if I was sad or tired. Someone who'd remember what I took in my coffee. She laughed shakily. I wanted someone to matter to, and who'd matter to me. I wanted to feel alive again instead of just surviving. And now? Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now that I'm here? Martha looked at him, this kind, broken, steadfast man who traveled so far on the strength of her desperate words, who worked without complaint and washed dishes and made her laugh, who looked at her like she was worth crossing a continent for. Now, she said, her heart pounding, I think maybe God heard that prayer after all. I just didn't recognize the answer when it arrived. The fire crackled between them, and outside the storm howled, but inside this small farmhouse on the Montana prairie, two lost souls had found their way to something that might, with time and courage, become a home. Samuel's words hung in the air between them like something sacred and fragile. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the small parlor. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the house, wind screaming around the eaves, but inside, wrapped in blankets and honesty, Martha felt safer than she had in years. She opened her mouth to respond, to say something that might match the vulnerability he'd just shown her, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say that wouldn't sound like a promise she wasn't ready to make? Or worse, a rejection of the gift he was offering. Samuel seemed to sense her struggle. He stood slowly, favoring that left leg, and added another log to the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney, and the fresh wood caught with a soft whoosh. You don't have to say anything, he told her gently, settling back into his chair. I didn't tell you that to put pressure on you. I just wanted you to know that being here, working beside you, sharing meals and conversation, it's given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose, hope, a reason to wake up in the morning that goes beyond just surviving another day. You've given me that too, Martha said softly. I just haven't known how to say it. Then we're even. His smile was warm in the firelight, and that's enough for now. They sat in companionable silence after that, listening to the storm and the crackling fire, until Martha's eyes grew heavy and she found herself nodding off in her chair. When she jerked awake with a start, embarrassed, Samuel was watching her with gentle amusement. Go on to bed, he said. I'll keep the fire going and make sure we don't all freeze to death in our sleep. You need rest too, Martha protested. I'll sleep, but I'm used to keeping watch. Old army habits die hard. He pulled the blanket she'd given him up around his shoulders. Besides, I sleep better knowing someone's tending to things. Makes me feel useful. Martha wanted to tell him he was more than useful, that he'd become essential to the rhythm of her days, that the thought of him leaving made her chest ache in ways she wasn't ready to examine. But those words felt too big, too revealing, so instead she simply said, Thank you, Samuel, for everything. Sweet dreams, Martha. The sound of her Christian name in his voice followed her up the stairs and into sleep, where Thomas waited in that field of unplanted apple trees. You're falling for him, Dream Thomas said, and there was no accusation in it, only gentle observation. I don't know what I'm doing, Martha admitted. Yes, you do. You're living. You're letting yourself care again. That's the bravest thing a person can do after loss, choose to love anyway. But what if it's too soon? What if people talk? Thomas laughed, that warm sound she'd thought she'd never hear again, even in dreams. When has Martha Ellison ever cared what people think? You married me against your father's wishes, came west when everyone said you were crazy, fought to keep this farm when they all said you should sell. You've never been afraid of what people think, love. Don't start now. I'm afraid of being hurt again. I know. But you're hurting anyway, aren't you? At least this way you've got a chance at joy. She woke with tears on her face and dawn light struggling through the heavy snowfall. When she came downstairs, she found Samuel asleep in the chair by the fire, his head tilted at an angle that would surely give him a crick in his neck. He'd kept the fire going all night, just as he'd promised. The woodbox was nearly empty, meaning he'd made multiple trips out into the storm to keep them warm. Martha stood watching him sleep, this man who'd become so much more than she'd ever expected. In the gray morning light, she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the silver beginning to thread through his hair at the temples. He looked vulnerable in sleep, younger and older all at once. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened. For a moment he looked disoriented. Then he saw her and smiled. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Storms passed." "You should have woken me to take a turn with the fire." "You needed the rest." He stretched carefully, wincing. "Besides, gave me time to think." "About what?" Samuel stood, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. "About how long it's been since I felt like I belonged somewhere, and how strange it is to find that feeling in a place I'd never been, with someone I'd never met, all because of a letter you didn't even remember writing." Martha's heart squeezed. "Samuel, let me finish," he said gently. "I know this wasn't what you planned. I know you're still figuring out how you feel about all this, but I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever you decide, I'm grateful. You've given me back something I thought was gone forever. You've reminded me what it feels like to be needed." "You are needed," Martha said, the words bursting out before she could stop them. "These past weeks, you've become—" She paused, searching for the right words. "You've become part of the fabric of things here. When I wake up, I listen for sounds from the bunkhouse. When I'm working, I find myself thinking about what you'd say, how you'd solve a problem. When I cook, I'm cooking for two instead of just going through the motions. You've made this place feel less like a tomb and more like a home again." Samuel's eyes brightened with something that might have been hope or might have been tears. "Then maybe we're both getting what we need." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility, until Martha broke it by turning toward the kitchen. "I'll make breakfast," she said. "You must be starving after keeping watch all night." As she cooked, she was acutely aware of Samuel moving around the house, adding wood to the fire, checking the windows for damage from the storm, doing the small tasks that made a house run smoothly. It felt domestic in a way that both comforted and terrified her. This was what marriage looked like, she thought, not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but this quiet partnership, this easy rhythm of two people taking care of each other in their shared space. Over breakfast, thick slices of bacon, eggs from their chickens, bread she'd baked 2 days ago, Samuel brought up a subject they'd been avoiding. "Christmas is in 3 weeks," he said. "I know it's probably a difficult time for you, Thomas being gone and all, but I was thinking maybe we could do something small. Make it feel a little less lonely." Martha's first instinct was to refuse. Christmas had been unbearable last year. She'd spent it alone, crying into her pillow, remembering all the plans she and Thomas had made for Christmases that would never come. But looking at Samuel across the table, seeing the hopeful uncertainty in his eyes, she found herself nodding. "I usually cut a small pine from the North Ridge," she said. "Thomas and I started that tradition our first year here. We'd decorate it with whatever we could find, strings of dried berries, paper stars, pine cones." "I'd like to help with that," Samuel said. "If you'll let me." "I'd like that too." As December deepened and Christmas approached, Martha found herself looking forward to the holiday for the first time in years. She and Samuel spent evenings stringing berries and popping corn to make garland, their fingers working in tandem while they talked about everything and nothing. He told her stories about Christmases in Ohio, about his mother's terrible fruitcake that everyone pretended to love, about his father's tradition of reading the nativity story in a deliberately terrible British accent that made everyone laugh. She shared memories too, her sister's wedding one Christmas Eve, the year Thomas surprised her with a music box he'd traded 3 months' worth of eggs for. The simple joy of waking up on Christmas morning with someone who loved you beside you. "Do you think about getting married again?" Samuel asked one evening as they worked. The question was casual, but Martha heard the weight beneath it. "I do now," she admitted. "Before you came, I thought that part of my life was over. I'm 32, Samuel. I'm not a young woman anymore. And out here, opportunities for meeting someone are—" She gestured vaguely at the endless prairie beyond the windows. "Age is just a number," Samuel said. "My mother was 35 when she married my father. Had 5 healthy children after that. You've got years ahead of you, Martha. Years that shouldn't be spent alone if you don't want them to be." "What about you?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "Is that what you want? Marriage again? A family?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the garland. I used to think I wanted exactly what I had before, to recreate what I lost. But I'm learning that's not how life works. You can't go back. You can only go forward. He looked at her, his gray-blue eyes serious. So yes, I want marriage again, but not as a replacement for what I had, as something new, something built on understanding what it means to lose everything and choose to keep living anyway. Martha's breath caught. They were dancing around something, circling it like wary animals, neither quite brave enough to name it, but both feeling its pull. 2 days before Christmas, they set out to cut a tree. The snow was deep, the air sharp and clean, and their breath came out in clouds as they trudged through the drifts toward the north ridge. Samuel carried the axe, moving more slowly than usual because of his leg, but he refused Martha's offers to turn back. "I've been looking forward to this," he said. "Don't rob me of the experience because of a little discomfort." They found a perfect pine, full and fragrant, standing alone on a small rise. As Samuel chopped, Martha found herself watching him. The competent swing of the axe, the concentration on his face, the way he paused every few strokes to assess his progress. This was a man who did everything with intention and care, she thought. Nothing was done halfway or carelessly. When the tree fell, they dragged it together back to the house, laughing and slipping in the snow, their faces red with cold and exertion. Getting it set up in the parlor took another hour of adjustment and readjustment, with Samuel lying on the floor to secure the base while Martha directed him. "A little to the left. No, too much. Back to the right. Perfect. Wait, now it's leaning." Samuel's laughter rumbled up from beneath the tree. "Woman, I think you just like bossing me around." "Maybe I do," Martha said, surprised to find herself teasing. When had that become comfortable? When had they crossed the line from careful politeness to easy banter? That evening, they decorated the tree together, hanging their homemade ornaments and standing back to admire their work. The parlor smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the firelight made the simple decorations gleam. "It's beautiful," Martha whispered. "It is," Samuel agreed, but when she glanced at him, he was looking at her instead of the tree. Heat rushed to her face. "Samuel, I know," he said quickly. "I'm not pushing. I just want you to know that I see you, Martha. I see how hard you work, how brave you are, how you've built a life out of ashes and determination. I see you, and I think you're remarkable." No one had called her remarkable in years. Thomas had once, but that felt like a different lifetime. Martha didn't know what to do with the compliment, how to hold something so precious without crushing it. "You see more than is there," she managed. "I see exactly what's there. You just don't see it yourself yet." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Martha woke to the smell of coffee and something sweet baking. Samuel had somehow managed to make cinnamon rolls in her kitchen using precious sugar and spices they'd been hoarding. "You didn't have to do this," she said, coming into the kitchen still in her robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. Samuel turned from the stove, and something flickered in his eyes when he saw her. Something warm and wanting that made her suddenly aware of how intimate this was, standing in her kitchen in her nightclothes while he cooked breakfast. "I wanted to," he said simply. "Catherine used to make these every Christmas morning. It felt right to carry on the tradition." They ate by the fire, the Christmas tree standing sentinel in the corner. Martha had worried this would be painful, that remembering all she'd lost would overwhelm the moment, but instead she felt peaceful, grateful even. After breakfast, Samuel retrieved something from his coat pocket, a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I made you something," he said, handing it to her. "It's not much, but—" Martha unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a delicate wooden box, no bigger than her palm, with a hinged lid. The wood had been sanded smooth as silk, and on the top, Samuel had carved an intricate design of prairie grass and wildflowers. "Samuel," she breathed, "it's exquisite." "For your letters," he explained, "or anything precious you want to keep safe. The wood's cedar, so it'll keep moths away if you store fabric or ribbons in it." Martha ran her fingers over the carving, marveling at the detail. This represented hours of work, done secretly in the bunkhouse after long days of farm labor. Done for her. "I didn't get you anything," she said, mortified. "You've given me everything that matters," Samuel said. "A home, purpose, hope. I don't need anything else." But Martha stood quickly, overcome with the need to give him something, anything. She went to her bedroom and retrieved the only thing of value she had left, Thomas's pocket watch. The one his father had given him, the one she'd kept in her drawer because she couldn't bear to look at it, but couldn't bear to get rid of it either. When she came back downstairs and pressed it into Samuel's hands, his eyes widened. "Martha, I can't take this. This was your husband's, and he would want it to be used, not gathering dust in a drawer," Martha said firmly. Thomas was practical above all else. He'd hate knowing something useful was being wasted on sentiment. She closed Samuel's fingers around it. "Besides, you've earned it. You've worked this farm as hard as any man could. You've honored his memory by taking care of what he built. It should be yours." Samuel's throat worked. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He opened the watch, and they both heard the soft tick of its mechanism, still keeping perfect time after all these years. Inside the case was a small photograph. Martha and Thomas on their wedding day, young and hopeful and impossibly naive about what lay ahead. "I'll treasure it," Samuel said quietly. "Not just the watch, but the trust it represents." That afternoon, as the winter sun began its early descent, they bundled up and walked to the small cemetery on the hill. Martha had dreaded this moment, worried about how it would feel to bring Samuel to Thomas's grave, but when they stood there, the snow crunching beneath their feet, it felt right somehow. "Thomas Ellison," Samuel read from the simple wooden marker, "beloved husband, 1848-1883, gone too soon." "He was 35, Martha said softly. "We had 5 years together. It wasn't nearly enough." Samuel was quiet for a moment, then said, "If you don't mind, I'd like to say something." Martha nodded, surprised. Samuel removed his hat and addressed the grave as though Thomas were standing before them. "Sir, I want you to know I'm taking good care of her, and of the land you worked so hard to build. I'm trying to honor what you started, not replace it. Martha's told me what kind of man you were. Honest, hardworking, devoted. I can only hope to live up to that example." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks, but they weren't entirely sad. There was something healing in this moment, in Samuel's respectful acknowledgement of the man who'd come before him. "He would have liked you," she said, her voice thick. "Thomas always said the measure of a man was in his actions, not his words. You've proven yourself through what you do, day after day. He would have respected that." As they walked back to the house through the gathering dusk, Samuel reached for Martha's hand. She startled at the contact but didn't pull away. His hand was warm and calloused and steady, and holding it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Neither of them spoke about it, just walked hand in hand through the snow as the first stars began to emerge overhead. That evening, sitting by the fire after supper, Martha finally voiced the question that had been building in her heart for weeks. "Samuel, what are we doing here? What is this becoming?" He set down the sock he'd been darning, another domestic task he'd simply taken on without being asked, and looked at her seriously. "I think we're becoming partners," he said. "Maybe more, if you're willing. But I need you to know I'm not trying to replace Thomas. I'm not trying to make you forget him or pretend he didn't matter. I'm just trying to build something new, something that honors both our pasts while giving us a future." "I don't know if I'm ready for more," Martha admitted. "But I also don't know if I want things to stay as they are. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. Catherine's been gone 3 years, and I still have days where I miss her so much I can barely breathe. But I also have days where I wake up grateful to be alive, excited about what's ahead. Both things can be true at once." "How do you know when you're ready?" Martha asked. "How do you know when it's time to move forward instead of just surviving?" Samuel thought about this, firelight playing across his features. "I don't think you ever know for sure. I think you just reach a point where the fear of staying stuck becomes greater than the fear of moving forward, where the possibility of joy outweighs the safety of numbness. And you've reached that point?" "I have," he said steadily. "The question is, have you?" Martha looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. Had she reached that point? A month ago, she would have said no without hesitation. But now, with Samuel sitting across from her, with the memory of his hand in hers still warm on her skin, with the evidence of his care all around her in the form of mended fences and fixed roofs and small wooden boxes carved with prairie flowers. "I think I might be getting there," she whispered. Samuel's smile was like sunrise. Then that's enough. We'll take it one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations, just two people figuring out how to live again, together. As winter deepened into January, their relationship shifted in subtle ways. Samuel still slept in the bunkhouse, still maintained the proper boundaries, but the space between them felt less like protection and more like habit. They worked together seamlessly now, able to anticipate each other's needs without speaking. Martha would reach for a tool and find Samuel already handing it to her. Samuel would start to explain a repair and find Martha already understanding what needed to be done. They began to share more of their histories, peeling back layers like skins of an onion. Samuel told her about the war, about the horror of Cold Harbor, where he'd lost so many friends and nearly lost his leg, about the guilt of surviving when better men had died, about the long recovery where he'd had to learn to walk again, to trust that his body wouldn't betray him. Martha shared things she'd never told anyone, how she and Thomas had lost a pregnancy early on, how that loss had carved a hole in her that never quite healed, how sometimes she wondered if the fever taking Thomas was God's punishment for some failure on her part, how alone she'd felt in the months after, like she was screaming into a void that would never answer back. It wasn't punishment, Samuel said gently when she confessed this fear. Death is just part of life. It's not fair and it's not planned, and it's certainly not divine retribution for imagined failings. Sometimes terrible things just happen, and all we can do is keep breathing until the pain becomes bearable. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple at all. It's the hardest thing in the world. But you've already done it, Martha. You survived the worst day of your life, and the day after that, and the day after that. You're stronger than you know. One evening in late January, a neighbor stopped by. Old Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who'd brought a casserole after Thomas's funeral. She'd come to borrow some preserves, she said, but Martha could see the curiosity burning in her eyes as she took in Samuel's presents, the easy way he and Martha moved around each other in the kitchen. "So this is your hired man I've heard about," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone making it clear she'd heard more than just that. "This is Samuel Grant," Martha said evenly. "He's been helping with the farm." "I see." Mrs. Henderson's gaze was sharp. "Must be quite a help having a man around the place again. Though folks do talk, you know. A widow and an unmarried man living on the same property?" Martha felt her spine stiffen. "Mr. Grant lives in the bunkhouse, and our arrangement is perfectly respectable." "Oh, I'm sure it is, dear. I'm just saying you know how people are, always ready to assume the worst." She accepted the jar of preserves Martha handed her. "Of course, there's a simple solution if you wanted to stop the gossip." "And what would that be?" Samuel asked, his voice mild but his eyes sharp. "Why, marriage, of course. A widow can hardly be blamed for remarrying, especially to someone who's clearly been such a help. And it would make everything proper and above board." After Mrs. Henderson left, Martha stood at the window, her hands clenched into fists. "Don't let her get to you," Samuel said softly. "People always talk. It doesn't matter what we do." "But she's right, isn't she?" Martha turned to face him. "As long as you're living here unmarried, people will assume the worst. Your reputation, my reputation—" "I don't care about my reputation," Samuel interrupted. "And anyone who knows you would never believe anything unseemly. But if the talk bothers you, if it makes your life harder, I can leave. Find somewhere else." "Oh, no!" The word came out more forcefully than Martha intended. "No, I don't want you to leave." "Then what do you want?" It was the question she'd been avoiding for months. What did she want? Safety, security, companionship, or something more, something that scared her with its intensity? "I want," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "to stop being afraid. I want to trust that caring about someone again won't destroy me. I want to believe that I deserve a second chance at happiness." Samuel crossed the room and took both her hands in his. "You do deserve it, Martha. You deserve all the happiness in the world. But what if I can't do it? What if I try and fail? What if I hurt you because I'm still too broken?" "Then we'll be broken together," Samuel said simply. "But I don't think you're as broken as you believe. I think you're healing. I think we both are." That night, Martha lay awake for hours, wrestling with herself. Part of her wanted to throw caution to the wind, to tell Samuel she was ready for whatever came next. But another part, the part that had been devastated by loss, whispered warnings about moving too fast, about making decisions from loneliness rather than love. How could you tell the difference? How could you know if what you felt was real or just the desperate grasping of two damaged people trying not to drown? The answer came to her as she watched moonlight paint patterns on her ceiling. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe love was always a risk, always a leap of faith. Maybe the real question wasn't whether she was sure, but whether she was willing to try. The next morning, Martha woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She found Samuel in the barn, checking on the cow who was due to calf any day. "Samuel," she said, and something in her tone made him turn immediately. "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Henderson said, about marriage." His expression carefully neutral. And I think we should talk about it. Really talk about it, not just dance around the edges like we've been doing. Samuel set down the bucket he'd been holding. "All right, let's talk." They sat on hay bales in the quiet barn, their breath visible in the cold air. "I care about you," Martha began. "More than I thought I could care about anyone again. You've become essential to me in ways I didn't think were possible. But I'm terrified of making a mistake, of dishonoring Thomas's memory, of rushing into something because I'm lonely rather than because it's right." "Those are all valid fears," Samuel said. "I share most of them. I'm terrified of disappointing you, of not measuring up to what you had before, of building a life on a foundation that might crumble if we're not careful." "So where does that leave us?" Samuel reached for her hand. "I think it leaves us being honest. I love you, Martha. I didn't plan to, and I know it's complicated and messy, and probably too soon by any reasonable measure, but I love you, not as a replacement for Catherine, and not just because I'm grateful for shelter and work. I love you because you're brave and strong and kind, because you make me laugh, because working beside you feels like the most natural thing in the world, because when I think about my future, you're in every part of it." Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. "Samuel, you don't have to say it back," he continued quickly. "I'm not asking for that. I just needed you to know where I stand. Whatever you decide, however long you need, I'll wait, because you're worth waiting for." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks. When was the last time someone had told her she was worth waiting for? When had anyone shown her this kind of patient, steadfast devotion? "I can't say I love you yet," she whispered. "Not because I don't feel something, but because I need to be sure it's real, and not just need or loneliness or fear." "I understand. But I can say that I want to try. I want to see where this goes. And if you're willing to be patient with me, to let me find my way at my own pace, then maybe we could build something real," Samuel finished. "Together." "Together," Martha agreed. They sat in the quiet barn, hands clasped, both acutely aware that they'd just crossed some invisible threshold. They weren't making promises yet, weren't rushing to the altar, but they'd acknowledged what was growing between them. They'd given it words and breath and reality. It was, Martha thought, the bravest thing she'd done since she'd buried Thomas and decided to keep living. The cow chose that moment to low softly, reminding them of the reason Samuel had been in the barn in the first place. "I should check on her," Samuel said, but he didn't immediately let go of Martha's hand. "And I should start breakfast," Martha replied, but she didn't move either. They sat there a moment longer, neither quite ready to break the spell of this fragile, precious understanding they'd reached. Then Samuel squeezed her hand gently and released it, turning his attention to the expectant cow while Martha made her way back to the house. As she cooked, she found herself humming, an old hymn her mother used to sing, one she hadn't thought of in years. The sound surprised her, filled the kitchen with something that felt almost like joy. Outside, the January sun climbed higher, and through the window she could see Samuel moving around the barn, could see smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney, could see evidence everywhere of a life being rebuilt from ruins. And for the first time since Thomas died, Martha allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning a new chapter, one written in the careful handwriting of second chances and hard-won hope. The cow delivered her calf 3 days later, in the deep hours before dawn, when the world hung suspended between darkness and light. Martha woke to the sound of Samuel's urgent knocking on the kitchen door, his voice rough with concern cutting through her sleep. "Martha," The cow's in trouble. I need help." She was out of bed and dressed in minutes, not bothering with more than a shawl thrown over her nightgown, her feet shoved into boots without stockings. The February cold hit her like a slap as she ran across the yard to the barn, where lantern light spilled through the open door in golden pools across the snow. Inside, the cow was on her side, breathing hard, her eyes rolling white with pain and fear. Samuel was already kneeling beside her, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold, his hands gentle as he examined her. "The calf's breech," he said without looking up. "I'm going to have to turn it." Martha had seen difficult births before, had lost animals and nearly lost herself helping Thomas through similar situations. She knew the odds, knew how quickly things could go wrong, but she also knew that panic helped nothing. "Tell me what you need," she said, dropping to her knees in the straw beside him. For the next hour they worked in concert, Samuel's strong hands working with infinite patience to turn the calf while Martha held the cow's head, speaking soft words of comfort, keeping her as calm as possible. The barn filled with the sounds of labored breathing, murmured reassurances, and prayers whispered under breath. "Almost there," Samuel muttered, his face tight with concentration. "Come on, little one. Work with me." And then, with a rush that seemed almost miraculous, the calf slipped free into Samuel's waiting hands. For one terrible moment, it lay still and lifeless, and Martha's heart clenched with the fear of losing something they'd fought so hard to save. But Samuel was already clearing the calf's nose and mouth, rubbing its chest vigorously with rough burlap. "Come on," he urged. "Breathe, breathe." The calf's chest hitched once, twice, and then it drew in a shuddering breath and let out a weak but unmistakable bleat. The mother cow lifted her head, her maternal instincts overriding exhaustion, and began lowing softly to her baby. Martha felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't have said whether they were from relief or exhaustion or the simple beauty of new life emerging from struggle. Samuel looked up and their eyes met across the miracle they'd just witnessed, and something passed between them that had no name but felt like understanding at its deepest level. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it," Samuel corrected, wiping his hands on the burlap. "I couldn't have managed without you. You knew exactly what I needed before I asked." "That's what partners do," Martha said, and realized as she spoke that she'd used the word deliberately. Partners. Not employer and hired hand, not widow and stranger. Partners. Samuel's eyes softened. "Yes, that's exactly what partners do." They stayed in the barn until the calf was nursing, until they were certain both mother and baby were stable. By then, dawn was breaking properly, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and they stumbled back to the house exhausted and filthy and somehow lighter than they'd been before. "I'll make coffee," Martha said, her voice hoarse from an hour of steady encouragement to the laboring cow. "I'll clean up and start breakfast," Samuel offered. "You look done in." "We're both done in," Martha pointed out, but she didn't argue. The truth was she was trembling with fatigue, operating on adrenaline that was rapidly fading. They moved around the kitchen in their familiar dance, but there was something different now, something that had shifted during those dark hours in the barn. When Samuel's hand brushed hers as he reached for the coffee pot, neither of them pulled away. When Martha leaned against him for just a moment, steadying herself against the table, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders without hesitation. "Thank you," she said softly, "for knowing what to do, for saving them both." "We saved them," Samuel corrected again. "Martha, you need to stop giving all the credit away. You're as capable as anyone I've ever met, more capable than most." She wanted to argue, to deflect the compliment as she'd done 100 times before. But she was too tired for false modesty, too raw from witnessing birth and near death to hide behind politeness. "I'm glad you were here," she said instead. "I'm glad I wasn't alone." "You'll never have to be alone again," Samuel said quietly. "Not if you don't want to be." The weight of those words settled around them like a blanket. Martha knew what he was offering, what he'd been offering since that conversation in the barn days ago. A future, a partnership, a life built on more than just mutual need and convenience. She also knew she was getting closer to being ready to accept it. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, both too exhausted for conversation. Then Samuel headed back to check on the cow and calf, while Martha finally dragged herself upstairs for a proper bath, and change of clothes. When she came back down an hour later, she found him asleep in the chair by the fire, his head tilted back, his face peaceful in a way it rarely was when he was awake. Martha stood watching him, this man who'd come into her life by accident and stayed by choice, who worked without complaint and asked for nothing but a chance to prove himself, who looked at her like she hung the moon and stars even when she was covered in barn muck and exhausted to the bone. Somewhere in the last 4 months, Samuel Grant had become essential to her in ways that went beyond practical help. He'd become the first person she thought of when she woke, and the last voice she wanted to hear before sleep. He'd become the measure against which she judged her days, good if they included time working beside him, empty if they didn't. He'd become, Martha realized with a jolt that was equal parts terror and wonder, the man she was falling in love with. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. She grabbed the back of the nearest chair to steady herself, her heart racing. When had it happened? When had gratitude and friendship transformed into something deeper, something that made her chest ache and her palms sweat and her stomach flutter like she was 16 instead of 32? There was no single moment, she realized. It had been accumulating in small increments, every shared meal, every laugh, every time he'd anticipated her needs or she'd understood his unspoken thoughts. It had been building in the comfortable silences and the easy conversations, in the way he said her name and the way she caught herself watching for him through the window. It had been growing all along, and she'd been too afraid to acknowledge it until now. Samuel stirred in his sleep, and Martha quickly busied herself with unnecessary tasks at the kitchen counter, not ready to face him with this new awareness burning through her veins. She needed time to think, to process, to figure out what to do with this terrifying, wonderful realization. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A knock at the door made them both jump, Samuel coming awake with a start, Martha dropping the spoon she'd been pretending to wash. Through the window, she could see the circuit preacher's horse tied to the post, and her heart sank. Reverend Michaels only made his rounds twice a year, and his visits always lasted for hours. "I'll get it," Samuel said, standing and finger-combing his hair into some semblance of order. Reverend Michaels was a rail-thin man of indeterminate age, with sharp eyes and a nose for gossip disguised as pastoral concern. He swept into the house with the cold air, his gaze taking in every detail, Samuel's presence, the 2 coffee cups on the table, the easy familiarity between them. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, his voice oily with false warmth, "what a pleasure to see you looking so well. And this must be the hired man I've heard so much about." "Reverend Michaels, this is Samuel Grant," Martha said, keeping her voice level despite the anxiety crawling up her spine. "Samuel, Reverend Michaels serves several congregations in the territory." The men shook hands, the Reverend's grip lingering just a moment too long, his eyes cataloging every detail of Samuel's appearance. "A pleasure, Mr. Grant. Tell me, how long have you been working for the widow?" The emphasis on widow felt deliberate, pointed. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Since September, sir. Mrs. Ellison was kind enough to give me employment when I found myself in need." "How charitable of her," the Reverend said, his tone suggesting anything but charity. "And you've been staying?" "In the bunkhouse," Samuel said evenly. "Where any hired hand would stay." Of course, of course." Reverend Michaels settled himself in the best chair without being invited, accepting the coffee Martha reluctantly offered. "Still, appearances do matter, don't they? A young widow and an unmarried man living in close quarters. Well, I'm sure you understand how tongues wag." Martha felt her temper flare. "Reverend, I assure you our arrangement is entirely proper. Mr. Grant has been nothing but respectful, and anyone who suggests otherwise is engaging in malicious gossip." "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything improper, my dear. I'm simply pointing out that perception often matters more than reality. The Bible does tell us to avoid even the appearance of evil." "The Bible also tells us not to bear false witness," Samuel said quietly, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "And to judge not, lest we be judged." The Reverend's eyes narrowed. "Are you a religious man, Mr. Grant?" "I try to be a good one, sir, not always successfully, but I try." "And yet you see nothing questionable about living in such close proximity to a woman who is not your wife?" "I see a woman who needed help and a man who needed work," Samuel said, I see two people supporting each other through difficult times, as Christians are called to do. If that's questionable in your eyes, I'd suggest your vision needs examining." Martha had to bite her lip to keep from laughing at the shocked expression on Reverend Michael's face. Clearly, he wasn't accustomed to being challenged. "Well," the Reverend said stiffly, "I can see that my pastoral guidance is not welcome here, but I must discharge my duty and tell you both that this arrangement cannot continue without serious spiritual consequences. Mrs. Ellison, as a member of my congregation, I must insist that you either dismiss Mr. Grant or remedy this situation through holy matrimony." "Are you seriously suggesting I should marry someone just to avoid gossip?" Martha asked, incredulous. "I'm suggesting that if you have genuine affection for this man, as I suspect you do based on the way you've been defending him, then you should make an honest arrangement of it. And if you don't have such affection, then yes, he should go. Those are your options, Mrs. Ellison. I'll be back through in the spring, and I expect to find this situation resolved one way or another." After the Reverend left, Martha and Samuel sat in stunned silence. "I'm sorry," Samuel said finally. "I shouldn't have spoken to him that way. I've probably made things worse for you." "Don't apologize," Martha said fiercely. "You said exactly what needed saying. I'm just furious that he thinks he has the right to dictate how I live my life." "He does have a point, though," Samuel said carefully. "Not about the gossip. I don't give a damn about that. But about making our situation clear. Martha, we've been dancing around this for months now. Maybe it's time to stop dancing and just decide." Martha's heart hammered. Decide what, exactly? Samuel stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair so they were eye to eye. Decide if this is something real or just convenience. Decide if what we feel for each other is worth building a life on. Decide if you're ready to trust me with your future, because God knows I'm ready to trust you with mine. "Samuel, I know I'm pushing," he said. "I know you need time. But that pompous fool of a preacher did accomplish one thing. He made me realize I don't want to waste any more time being cautious." "Life's too short, Martha. We both know that better than most. So I'm asking you plainly, do you love me? Because I love you, and I'm tired of pretending I don't." Martha looked into his gray-blue eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear of rejection, the desperate hope. She thought about the last 4 months, about every moment that had brought them to this point. She thought about the way her heart had expanded to make room for him, about the way her future looked different now, fuller, brighter, less lonely. She thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared and the life they'd built. And she realized with sudden clarity that loving Samuel didn't diminish what she'd had with Thomas. Love wasn't a finite resource that ran out once you'd used it up. It was something that could grow and change and make room for new people, new possibilities. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I love you." Samuel's face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunrise. "Say it again." "I love you, Samuel Grant. I love your patience and your kindness and the way you make me feel like I'm worth something. I love how you work and how you laugh and how you look at me like I'm the answer to a prayer you've been praying for years." "You are," he breathed. "You're exactly that." He cupped her face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her, and Martha felt something inside her that had been frozen since Thomas died finally, fully thaw. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning this new language of affection. Then it deepened, became something more. A promise, a claim, a recognition of everything they'd been building toward. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not because that sanctimonious preacher says we should, and not to stop gossip. Marry me because I love you and you love me, and because life's too precious to waste being careful when we could be happy instead." Martha laughed, the sound shaky with tears and joy. "That's the worst proposal I've ever heard." "It's the only proposal you've heard in the last few years, so you don't have much basis for comparison," Samuel pointed out, grinning. "Fair point." Martha kissed him again, quick and sweet. "Yes, Samuel, yes, I'll marry you." He stood, pulling her with him, and spun her in a circle that made her shriek with laughter. When he set her down, they were both dizzy and grinning like fools. "When?" Samuel asked. "Please say soon, because I don't think I can go back to sleeping in that bunkhouse now that I know you love me." "Samuel Grant," Are you suggesting something improper? Martha teased. I'm suggesting we get married as quickly as humanly possible so everything is completely proper, he corrected. How long does it take to arrange a wedding out here? Martha considered. Reverend Michaels won't be back until spring, and I wouldn't ask that pompous ass to marry us anyway. But there's a justice of the peace in Helena. If we rode out tomorrow, we could be married by the end of the week. Tomorrow it is, then. Samuel paused, suddenly uncertain. Unless you want something bigger? A real ceremony with all the trimmings? Martha thought about her first wedding, the elaborate affair her parents had insisted on, the dress that had cost more than a year's worth of groceries, the 100 guests who'd come more out of obligation than joy. It had been beautiful, but it had also been exhausting and ultimately meaningless. The marriage was what mattered, not the wedding. I don't need big, she said. I just need you and me and someone to make it legal. Everything else is just decoration. That night, they sat up late making plans, their hands clasped across the table, neither willing to let go for more than a moment. They talked about how to combine their lives, their possessions, their dreams. Samuel admitted he had a small savings he'd been holding back, meant for starting over somewhere else if things didn't work out. Martha confessed she'd been setting aside egg money for months, just in case she needed to hire help come spring. We can use it to improve the farm, she said. Maybe buy more livestock or build a proper addition to the house. It's going to feel cramped with both of us living in there. We could add a bedroom, Samuel suggested. Maybe 2 if we're being optimistic about the future. The implication made Martha blush, but she didn't shy away from it. You want children? I'd be lying if I said I didn't, Samuel admitted. I know it's not guaranteed, and I know we're not as young as we once were, but if God blesses us that way, I'd welcome it with my whole heart. I want that too, Martha said softly. I've wanted it for so long I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't possible anymore. Maybe it will be. Maybe it won't. But either way, we'll have each other. That's more than enough. They decided to leave for Helena at first light, taking the wagon and praying the roads were passable despite the snow. Martha packed a small bag with her best dress, the gray silk she'd worn to church before Thomas died, carefully preserved and only slightly moth-eaten. It wasn't a wedding dress, but it would do. Samuel had his good suit, the one he'd worn when he first arrived, now cleaned and pressed. That night, Martha lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was she doing the right thing? Was it too fast? What would people say? What would Thomas think? But every time doubt crept in, she remembered the feel of Samuel's lips on hers, the joy in his eyes when she'd said yes, the way her heart had felt light for the first time in years, and she remembered Thomas in her dreams, telling her to live, to choose happiness, to not be afraid. This was living. This was choosing. This was brave. The journey to Helena took 2 days, the wagon creaking through snow-packed roads while Martha and Samuel talked and laughed and planned their future. They stayed in a boarding house the first night, in separate rooms, of course, and Martha lay awake listening to Samuel moving around in the room next door, knowing that soon there would be no more walls between them. The justice of the peace was a kindly older man named Judge Harrison, who asked no questions about their circumstances, just congratulated them on finding each other and wished them every happiness. The ceremony itself took less than 10 minutes, with the judge's wife and clerk serving as witnesses. Do you, Samuel Grant, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Samuel said, his voice strong and sure. And do you, Martha Ellison, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, under the same sacred vows? Martha looked at Samuel, this good man who'd crossed a continent on the strength of her desperate letter, who'd stayed when she tried to send him away, who'd loved her patiently until she was ready to love him back. She thought of all they'd already weathered together and all that lay ahead, and she felt nothing but certainty. I do. The judge pronounced them husband and wife, and when Samuel kissed her, it felt like a beginning and a homecoming all at once. They stayed in Helena that night, in a modest hotel that felt almost luxurious after months of farm living. Samuel carried her over the threshold of their room, both of them laughing at the romantic silliness of it, and then he set her down carefully and cupped her face in his hands. Are you happy? He asked seriously. I'm terrified and exhilarated and more hopeful than I've been in years, Martha admitted. So yes, I think that counts as happy. Good, because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way. That night, they came together with a tenderness that acknowledged both their experience and their newness to each other. This wasn't the awkward fumbling of young lovers. They'd both been married before, knew the geography of intimacy. But it was also entirely new because they were learning each other's particular needs, each other's specific joys. Afterward, lying in Samuel's arms with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow and steady beneath her ear, Martha felt a peace she'd thought was lost forever. This was what she'd been afraid of, this vulnerability, this opening of her heart to the possibility of pain. But it was also what she'd been missing, this connection, this intimacy, this sense of being seen and known and cherished. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. Samuel's arms tightened around her. I love you too, more than I thought I could love anyone again. Do you think they'd be happy for us? Martha asked. Thomas and Catherine? Samuel was quiet for a moment, considering. I think they'd want us to be happy. And if this makes us happy, and it does, doesn't it? Then yes, I think they'd approve. It does make me happy, Martha confirmed. Terrifyingly happy. Good kind of terrifying or bad kind? The kind where you know your life is about to change completely and you're not sure you're ready, but you're doing it anyway because the alternative is staying stuck. That's the best kind of terrifying, Samuel said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. They talked until the early hours about everything and nothing, making plans and sharing dreams and simply reveling in the newness of being able to say my husband and my wife without qualification or apology. When they finally slept, wrapped in each other's arms, Martha dreamed of apple trees blooming on the hill behind the house, their branches heavy with white flowers that smelled like hope. The journey home took another 2 days, but it felt different now. They were returning not as widow and hired hand, but as husband and wife, partners in the truest sense. When they crested the final hill and saw the farm spread out below them, smoke rising from the chimney where they'd banked the fire, Martha felt something swell in her chest. Home, she said softly. Our home, Samuel corrected, and the possessive made her smile. They unloaded the wagon together, working in their familiar rhythm, but everything felt different now. When Samuel's hand brushed hers, he let it linger. When Martha passed close by him in the kitchen, he dropped a kiss on her temple. Small touches, small acknowledgments of their changed status, but each one felt precious and new. That evening, as they sat down to their first meal as husband and wife in their own home, Samuel raised his coffee cup in a toast. To new beginnings, he said. To second chances, Martha added. To love that finds a way, they said together, and clinked their cups with a ceremonial solemnity that dissolved into laughter. Later, as they prepared for bed, in the same room now, no more separate sleeping arrangements, Martha caught sight of herself in the small mirror and stopped. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, still worn by hardship, still marked by loss, but also illuminated by something that looked like joy. What are you thinking? Samuel asked, coming to stand behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. I'm thinking about the letter, Martha said. The one I wrote and forgot. The one that brought you here. What about it? I'm thinking that maybe it wasn't a mistake after all. Maybe it was the bravest thing I ever did, even if I was too scared to remember doing it. Maybe sometimes we know what we need before we're ready to admit it. Samuel's reflection smiled at her in the mirror. Or maybe God works through our desperate moments, turns our weakness into strength, our loneliness into love. Maybe, Martha agreed, turning in his arms to face him properly. Or maybe we just got lucky. I don't believe in luck, Samuel said, lowering his head to kiss her. I believe in providence, and providence brought me to you. As they settled into bed that night, Martha marveled at how natural it felt to have him there, how right. The loneliness that had defined her existence for 2 years had been replaced by this warm presence, this steady heartbeat beside her own. Outside, the February wind howled across the prairie, but inside, wrapped in her husband's arms, Martha felt only warmth. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges: animals to feed, repairs to make, a farm to run. But now she wouldn't face them alone. Now she had a partner, a love, a future that stretched out before her like the prairie itself, wide and open and full of possibility. The last thing she thought before sleep claimed her was that sometimes the best answers to prayers were the ones you didn't remember asking for, and sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as strangers on your doorstep, holding forgotten letters in their hands. Morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains, softer and warmer than Martha remembered it ever being before. She woke slowly, awareness creeping in by degrees, the unfamiliar weight of an arm draped across her waist, the sound of breathing that wasn't her own, the solid warmth of another body sharing the bed that had been empty for so long. For a disoriented moment, she tensed, her sleep-fogged mind struggling to place where she was and why she wasn't alone. Then memory flooded back, sweet and certain. Samuel, her husband, the wedding in Helena, the journey home, the night they'd spent learning each other in the darkness. She was Mrs. Samuel Grant now, no longer a widow defined by loss, but a wife building something new. Samuel stirred behind her, his arm tightening slightly before he seemed to wake fully. She felt him go still, then heard the soft intake of breath that told her he was experiencing the same momentary confusion, the same rush of remembering. "Good morning, wife," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with sleep. A smile spread across Martha's face before she could stop it. "Good morning, husband." They lay there a while longer, neither willing to break the spell of this first shared morning. Outside, the farm was waiting. Animals needed feeding, ice needed breaking, 100 small tasks that couldn't be postponed. But for these few stolen minutes, they allowed themselves to simply be, wrapped in the warmth of new marriage and old quilts. Eventually, practicality won out. Samuel kissed her shoulder and reluctantly pulled away, the cold air rushing in where his body heat had been. "I'll start the fire and put coffee on," he said, already reaching for his clothes. "You stay warm a bit longer." "We're married now," Martha pointed out, propping herself up on one elbow to watch him dress. "You don't have to wait on me." "I know I don't have to. I want to." He paused in buttoning his shirt, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Martha, I spent 3 years doing everything alone, carrying every burden by myself. Let me do things for you, not because you can't do them, but because it makes me happy to take care of you." How could she argue with that? "All right, but I reserve the right to take care of you too." "I'm counting on it," Samuel said, and headed downstairs. Martha dressed more slowly, her fingers fumbling with buttons as her mind wandered to the changes this marriage would bring. The bunkhouse would need to be cleaned out and repurposed, maybe as a storage room or workshop for Samuel. They'd need to make space in the bedroom for his things, reorganize the house to accommodate 2 lives instead of 1. Small practical matters, but each one represented a merging of their separate existences into something shared. When she came down to the kitchen, Samuel had coffee brewing and was already mixing batter for pancakes. The domesticity of it struck her, her husband cooking breakfast in her kitchen, humming tunelessly under his breath. Their kitchen now, their life. "I was thinking," Samuel said as he poured batter onto the griddle, "we should write to your sister and my brother in Ohio. Let them know about the marriage." Martha's stomach clenched. She'd been avoiding thinking about that particular complication. Her sister Elizabeth would have opinions, lots of them, about Martha remarrying so quickly to a man she'd known for less than 6 months. Elizabeth had never understood why Martha had married Thomas and moved west in the first place, had spent years sending letters full of veiled criticism disguised as concern. "Elizabeth will say it's too soon," Martha said quietly. "She'll say I'm being reckless and foolish." Samuel flipped the pancakes with practiced ease. "And what do you say?" "I say it's none of her business," Martha replied, more forcefully than she'd intended. "I say I've lived through more in the last 2 years than she has in her entire comfortable Boston existence, and I've earned the right to make my own choices without her approval." "Then that's what you tell her," Samuel said simply. "Or better yet, tell her you're happy. Tell her you found someone who loves you and treats you well. If she can't be happy for you, that's her failing, not yours." Martha moved to stand beside him at the stove, leaning her head briefly against his shoulder. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I just know what it's like to have people judge your choices when they have no idea what you've been through." He plated the pancakes and carried them to the table. My father-in-law never forgave me for Catherine's death, blamed me for getting her with child, said if I'd been more careful she'd still be alive. We haven't spoken since the funeral. That's not fair, Martha said, outraged on his behalf. You couldn't have known. No, I couldn't, but grief makes people cruel sometimes, makes them need someone to blame. Samuel poured syrup over his pancakes, his movements deliberate. I'm not angry at him anymore. I just understand that some people would rather cling to their pain than risk letting it go and finding peace. They ate in thoughtful silence, both contemplating the families they'd left behind and the new family they were creating here, in this small farmhouse on the Montana prairie. The morning passed in familiar rhythms, made new by their changed relationship. When Samuel headed out to tend the livestock, Martha found herself watching through the window, smiling at nothing in particular. When she went to the cellar for preserves and found Samuel had already reorganized the shelves, making everything easier to reach, her throat tightened with unexpected emotion. These small kindnesses, these considerations, they added up to something that felt like being cherished. Around midday, they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Martha looked up from the bread dough she was kneading to see Mrs. Henderson's familiar rig rolling up the lane, and her heart sank. News of their marriage couldn't have spread this quickly, could it? They'd only been back a day? But when the older woman climbed down from her wagon, her expression wasn't one of scandalous disapproval. Instead, she looked almost gleeful. Well, she announced the moment Martha opened the door, I heard the most interesting rumor at the Mercantile this morning. Someone said they saw you and Mr. Grant and Helena coming out of the courthouse looking very cozy indeed. I told them they must be mistaken, but then I thought, well, perhaps I should just ride out here and ask directly. Samuel appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants. Mrs. Henderson, what brings you out on such a cold day? Curiosity, Mr. Grant, pure curiosity. Her eyes darted between them, sharp and assessing. So? Is it true? Did you two get married? Martha lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed. We did. 3 days ago, before Judge Harrison and Helena. Mrs. Henderson's bantam flew to her chest. Well, I never, and without telling anyone. Without having a proper ceremony. We wanted it to be private, Samuel said, moving to stand beside Martha, his presence a solid support, just between us and God. And the judge, Mrs. Henderson added tartly. Well, I suppose congratulations are in order, though I must say it's all very sudden. Why, Mr. Grant has only been here since— Mrs. Henderson, Martha interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. We appreciate your concern, but our marriage is our business. Samuel and I know our own minds, and we're happy. That's all that matters. The older woman had the grace to look slightly abashed. Of course, dear. I didn't mean to imply anything improper. I'm just surprised, that's all. Though I suppose it does solve certain problems, doesn't it? No more need for gossip about the hired man living on the property when he's actually the husband. After Mrs. Henderson finally left, carrying with her the news that would be all over the county by nightfall, Martha sagged against the closed door. Well, that's done, she said. By tomorrow, everyone will know. And do you care? Samuel asked. Martha considered the question honestly. A month ago, she would have cared deeply, would have agonized over what people thought, whether they approved. But something had shifted in her, some fundamental change that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with finally choosing her own happiness over others' expectations. No, she said, surprised to find it was true. I really don't. Samuel's smile was radiant. Good, because I have plans for my wife that don't involve worrying about busybody neighbors. Oh? Martha raised an eyebrow. What kind of plans? Well, for starters, I was thinking we should convert the bunkhouse into a proper workshop. I could take on carpentry jobs from town, bring in extra income, and then there's the matter of that addition we talked about. We'll need at least 1 extra bedroom, maybe 2. The implication hung in the air between them, sweet with possibility. Children. A family. The future they both wanted but were too superstitious to speak about directly, as if naming it might jinx it. I'd like that, Martha said softly. All of it. The days that followed established new patterns, new rhythms. Samuel moved his belongings from the bunkhouse into the main house, and they spent an evening reorganizing drawers and closets to accommodate 2 lives instead of 1. Martha found herself making space not just in her home, but in her heart, letting go of old habits and old grief to make room for this new chapter. She took Thomas's photograph down from the mantel one evening, carefully wrapping it and placing it in a drawer upstairs. Samuel found her sitting on the bed, the wrapped photograph in her lap, tears streaming silently down her face. "You don't have to put it away," he said gently, sitting beside her. This was his home too. "I don't expect you to erase him." "I'm not erasing him," Martha said, wiping her eyes. "I'm just making room for us, for what we're building. It doesn't feel right to have him watching us all the time." "What feels right to you?" Martha thought about it. "I'd like to keep one picture out, maybe in our dresser. Something private, just for me. A way to remember without living in the past." "Then that's what you should do." Samuel took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Martha, I need you to know something. I'm not threatened by Thomas. I'm grateful to him, actually." "Grateful?" "He loved you well enough that you know what a good marriage looks like. He treated you with enough respect that you won't settle for less. He built this farm that's now giving us a future. In a way, he prepared you for this, for us. So yes, I'm grateful." Martha turned to him, this remarkable man who could speak so generously about the ghost that haunted their marriage. "I'm grateful to Catherine, too. She taught you gentleness and patience. She showed you what it means to love someone through everything. You learned that from her." They sat there on the bed, hands clasped, honoring the people who'd shaped them even as they built something new together. As February turned to March, the land began its slow awakening from winter's grip. The snow melted in patches, revealing muddy ground that would need to be worked and planted. Samuel and Martha spent long hours planning the spring crops, debating which fields should be planted with wheat versus hay, how many chickens they could afford to add to the flock. "We should get a few pigs," Samuel suggested one evening as they pored over seed catalogs by lamplight. "Good investment, and they'll eat the kitchen scraps." "And we'll need to repair the south fence before we can let the cattle out to pasture," Martha added. "That's going to take at least a week of solid work." "Then we'd better get started soon." Samuel made a note in the margin of the catalog. "I was also thinking we could plant fruit trees on that hill behind the house. Apple, maybe cherry. They'd take a few years to produce, but eventually—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes meeting Martha's. They were both thinking the same thing. Eventually implied a future, years stretching ahead of them, permanence. It was the first time either had spoken so casually about long-term plans, as if their being together was a settled fact rather than a fragile new reality. "I'd like that," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thomas and I always talked about planting an orchard, but we never got around to it. I think he'd be happy knowing it was finally happening." They planted the first trees in early April when the ground had thawed enough to dig. Samuel did the heavy work of making holes while Martha carefully positioned each sapling, her hands gentle on the tender roots. They planted 12 trees in total, 6 apple, 4 cherry, 2 pear, spacing them carefully to allow for growth. "By the time these bear fruit, we'll be old," Martha said, patting dirt around the last tree. "By the time these bear fruit, maybe we'll have children who'll climb them," Samuel countered, and the hope in his voice made Martha's chest ache. She hadn't told him yet that she'd missed her monthly courses. It was too early to be certain, too soon to get their hopes up, but she carried the possibility inside her like a secret flame, precious and terrifying. Spring work consumed them, plowing fields, planting crops, repairing winter damage to fences and buildings. They fell into bed each night exhausted and satisfied, their bodies aching with honest labor. But despite the fatigue, Martha found she'd never been happier. Working beside Samuel, building something together, felt like the most natural thing in the world. One warm May evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Samuel reached for Martha's hand. "I was thinking about what Mrs. Henderson said," he began, "about our marriage being sudden." "Having regrets?" Martha asked, trying to keep her tone light even as her heart clenched. "God, no. Best decision I ever made." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "I was just thinking about how strange it is that the best things in life often come from the most desperate moments." You wrote that letter in your darkest hour. I answered it because I was lost and broken, and somehow all that pain and loneliness led us to this. Maybe that's how it works, Martha said thoughtfully. Maybe we have to be broken before we can be remade into something better. Maybe. Samuel was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink lower. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't written that letter? Or if I hadn't answered it? If any one thing had been different? Martha had wondered many times. The fragile chain of events that had brought them together seemed almost miraculous in its improbability. If she'd burned the letter instead of mailing it, if Samuel had chosen to answer one of the other women who'd written to the agency, if the stagecoach had broken down, if she'd sent him away that first day, if either of them had been too afraid to take the risk. I think, she said slowly, that we were meant to find each other. Maybe not the way it happened, but somehow, I think lonely souls have a way of recognizing each other, even across great distances. You're more of a romantic than you let on, Samuel teased gently. Don't tell anyone. It would ruin my reputation as a practical frontier woman. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, one by one, in the darkening sky. Martha thought about the letter that had started everything, the desperate plea she'd written and forgotten. She'd been so ashamed of that moment of weakness, had spent months trying to justify or explain it away. But now she understood it differently. That letter hadn't been weakness. It had been hope disguised as desperation. It had been her heart refusing to give up, even when her mind had surrendered to loneliness. It had been the bravest thing she'd ever done, even if she'd been too frightened to remember doing it. Samuel, she said softly. I'm glad I forgot about the letter. He turned to look at her, puzzled. Why? Because if I'd remembered, I would have talked myself out of it. I would have found 100 reasons why it was foolish, why I should take it back, why you weren't really coming. I would have panicked and probably run you off the moment you arrived. She squeezed his hand. Sometimes our best decisions are the ones we make without overthinking them. Sometimes we have to trick ourselves into being brave. Samuel laughed, the sound warm and rich in the gathering darkness. So what you're saying is, we owe our happiness to your terrible memory? Exactly. He pulled her close, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Then I'm grateful for your terrible memory, and for desperate letters written in the dead of winter, and for stagecoaches that arrived on time, and for every impossible coincidence that brought us to this moment. Martha leaned into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of him, soap and wood smoke and honest sweat. This was home now, not just the farm, but this feeling, this sense of belonging to someone and having them belong to you. I need to tell you something, she said, the words emerging before she could second-guess them. She felt Samuel tense slightly. All right. I'm late. My monthly courses, they should have come 3 weeks ago, and they haven't. The silence stretched long enough that Martha began to panic. Maybe she shouldn't have said anything yet. Maybe it was too soon, too uncertain. Maybe... Are you sure? Samuel's voice was carefully neutral, as if he was afraid to hope too much. No, not completely. It could just be the change of season, or stress, or we're going to have a baby, Samuel finished. He turned her to face him, his hands framing her face, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. Martha, are we going to have a baby? I think we might be, she whispered. But it's early. Things can go wrong. We shouldn't... He kissed her, silencing her worried qualifications. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I know it's early. I know we shouldn't count on anything yet, but for right now in this moment, can we just be happy? Can we just sit with the possibility? Martha nodded, her own tears spilling over. Yes. Yes, we can do that. They held each other as the night deepened around them, two people who'd been broken by loss now daring to hope for new life. The prairie wind sang its endless song, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like a lullaby, like a promise, like the future unfolding before them. Over the next few weeks, Martha's body confirmed what her heart had begun to hope. The morning sickness started, gentle at first but growing more insistent. Her breast became tender, her fatigue deepened despite getting plenty of rest. And through it all, Samuel treated her like she was made of spun glass, insisting she rest more, work less, take better care of herself. I'm pregnant, not dying, Martha protested one morning when Samuel tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry outside. I know that, but you're carrying our child, and I'll be damned if I let you exhaust yourself when I'm perfectly capable of doing the work. Samuel Grant, I've been doing laundry for 32 years. I think I can manage. Martha Grant, he interrupted, emphasizing her new surname. You've been doing everything alone for too long. Let me help. Let me be part of this. She softened at the plea in his voice. This wasn't about him thinking her weak or incapable. This was about him wanting to participate, to feel useful, to protect the precious cargo she carried. All right, she conceded. But I'm still cooking dinner. I draw the line at being completely useless. You could never be useless, Samuel said, kissing her forehead. But I'll accept that compromise. As spring turned to summer and Martha's belly began to swell with unmistakable evidence of the life within, they received a letter from Elizabeth. Martha's sister had received the news of the marriage, delivered via the brief letter Martha had finally forced herself to write, and the response was everything Martha had feared. Married? Elizabeth had written in her sharp, precise hand. To a man you've known barely 6 months? A stranger who arrived on your doorstep claiming to be your mail-order husband? Martha, have you lost your senses? What would Thomas think? What would mother and father say? Martha read the letter aloud to Samuel, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. You know what Thomas would think? She said, crumpling the letter. He'd think I was living my life instead of mourning his forever. He'd think I deserved happiness. He'd approve of you, Samuel, because you're a good man who works hard and treats me well. And as for mother and father, they're dead and gone, and their opinions don't matter anymore. Do you want to write her back? Samuel asked carefully. No. Yes. I don't know. Martha threw the crumpled letter into the fire and watched it burn. I want to tell her that her judgment means nothing to me, that I'm happier now than I've been in years, that I'm going to have a baby, and I won't let her poison that joy with her narrow-minded disapproval. Then tell her that. So Martha did. She wrote a letter that was honest and firm, explaining that her life was her own to live, that Samuel was the best thing to happen to her in years, and that she'd appreciate Elizabeth keeping her criticisms to herself. She sealed it before she could reconsider, and Samuel rode into town to post it the next day. Think she'll write back? Samuel asked when he returned. Probably, and it'll probably be just as judgmental as the first one. Martha shrugged. But at least I'll know I stood up for us, for our marriage. That matters more than her approval. Samuel pulled her into his arms, resting his hand on the gentle swell of her belly. You're fierce, you know that? Like a mama bear protecting her cubs. I'm protecting our family, Martha said simply. That includes you. As summer deepened, Samuel began work on the addition to the house. 2 new bedrooms and an expanded kitchen. He worked in the early morning and evening when the heat was less intense, his skill with wood and tools evident in every precise cut and carefully fitted joint. Martha would sit in the shade, her hands busy with sewing tiny clothes for the baby, watching her husband build their future one board at a time. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, some out of genuine friendliness, others out of nosiness, and she'd serve them lemonade and deflect their prying questions with practiced politeness. The community's opinion of their marriage seemed divided. Some thought it scandalous, too quick, improper. Others saw it as practical, even romantic. 2 lonely people finding solace in each other. But increasingly, Martha found she didn't care what they thought. She had Samuel. She had their growing child. She had a life that felt full and purposeful. That was enough. One sweltering July afternoon, as Martha dozed in the shade and Samuel hammered away at the addition's frame, she was jolted awake by his shout. Martha, Martha, come quick! She struggled to her feet, 6 months pregnant now and ungainly, and hurried as fast as she could manage to where Samuel stood at the corner of the house, pointing toward the road. A wagon was approaching, but not one she recognized. As it drew closer, she could make out a man and woman on the seat, and in the back. Children, she breathed. Samuel, there are children in that wagon. The wagon pulled to a stop in their yard, and the man, weathered and tired-looking, climbed down. Afternoon, he said, removing his hat. Name's William Carter. This is my wife, Sarah. We're heading to Oregon, but Sarah's taken ill and we need to rest a few days before moving on. Someone in town said you might have space in a barn or outbuilding where we could camp. Martha looked at Sarah, who was clearly unwell, then at the three small faces peering out from the wagon bed. 2 boys and a girl, none of them older than 7 or 8. "Nonsense," she heard herself say. "You'll stay in the house. We have a spare room, and it's no trouble at all." Samuel shot her a look but backed her up immediately. "My wife's right. Let's get your family settled and see about making Mrs. Carter comfortable." The Carters protested, but not too strenuously. They were clearly desperate for rest and help. Within an hour, Sarah was tucked into the spare bedroom with cool compresses on her forehead. The children were fed and playing in the yard, and William was helping Samuel with the construction work in exchange for the hospitality. That evening, as Martha served supper to their expanded household, she caught Samuel's eye across the table. He was watching her interact with the children, answering their endless questions, wiping the littlest one's face, settling disputes with patient firmness, and the look on his face made her heart swell. Later, after the Carters had retired and they were alone in their own room, Samuel pulled Martha close. "You're going to be an amazing mother," he said softly. "You think so?" "I know so. I watched you today with those children. You were patient and kind and firm when you needed to be. Our baby is so lucky to have you." Martha laid her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Our baby is lucky to have both of us." The Carters stayed for 5 days. Sarah recovering slowly from what turned out to be a bad case of influenza. During that time, the house rang with children's laughter and the organized chaos of a full household. Martha found she loved it, the noise, the energy, the feeling of being needed by so many people at once. When the Carters finally left, pressing a jar of Sarah's famous strawberry preserves into Martha's hands as thanks, the house felt too quiet. "You miss them," Samuel observed. "I miss the life they represented," Martha admitted. "All those children, all that energy. I want that for us, Samuel. Not right away, maybe, but someday. I want our house to be full of noise and love and controlled chaos." "Then that's what we'll have," Samuel promised. "As many children as God blesses us with." The house felt emptier after the Carters left, but it was a different kind of emptiness than the loneliness Martha had known before Samuel arrived. This was the quiet anticipation of a space waiting to be filled, a future ready to unfold. She placed her hand on her swelling belly, feeling the flutter of movement that had become more pronounced in recent days, and smiled at the promise it held. August brought scorching heat that shimmered off the prairie in visible waves. Martha moved more slowly now, her body heavy with the child she carried, her ankles swollen despite Samuel's insistence that she keep her feet elevated. The baby was due in late October, according to her best calculations, which meant she had roughly 3 months left of this uncomfortable but miraculous waiting. Samuel had become almost comically protective, hovering whenever she stood for too long, rushing to carry anything heavier than a teacup, fretting over every wince or uncomfortable shift. It would have been annoying if it hadn't been so endearing. "I survived 2 years alone on this farm," Martha reminded him one particularly sweltering afternoon when he'd insisted she rest instead of helping hang laundry. "I think I can manage to pin some shirts to a clothesline." "You weren't carrying my child then," Samuel countered, gently steering her toward the porch swing he'd built specifically for her comfort. "And I wasn't here to take care of you. Now I am, so let me." "You're impossible," Martha said, but she sat down gratefully, the swing's gentle motion soothing. "I'm cautious. There's a difference." He knelt beside the swing, his hand finding her belly with the automatic tenderness that still made her heart skip. "This baby is everything to me, Martha. You're everything to me. I'm not taking any chances." The baby chose that moment to kick, strong enough that Samuel's eyes widened with wonder. No matter how many times he felt it, each movement seemed to amaze him anew. "Did you feel that?" Martha asked unnecessarily. "Our child is already stubborn," Samuel said with a grin. "Takes after the mother." "Or the father, who crossed half a continent on the strength of a forgotten letter." "Fair point." He kissed her belly, then her lips, then stood to finish the laundry while Martha watched from the swing, her heart so full it ached. The addition to the house was nearly complete now, 2 bright new bedrooms framed out and roofed, waiting only for the final interior work. Samuel had carved their initials into the main beam, MG and SG, intertwined, along with the date of their marriage, a permanent mark of their union, literally built into the structure of their home. One of the new rooms would be the nursery. Together, they'd painted it a soft yellow, using precious paint Samuel had ordered from Helena. Martha had sewn curtains from fabric she'd been saving for years, never quite knowing what to use it for. Now she knew. It had been waiting for this, for a room where their child would sleep and grow and dream. Samuel had spent weeks carving a cradle, the same skilled hands that had created the wooden box for Martha's letters, now fashioning a safe nest for their baby. The cradle was a work of art, with delicate designs of prairie flowers and wheat stalks adorning its sides, each detail rendered with painstaking care. "It's too beautiful to use," Martha had protested when he'd first shown it to her. "It's meant to be used," Samuel had insisted, "meant to rock our baby to sleep. And maybe, if we're blessed, other babies after this one." The thought of more children, of filling this house with the noise and chaos Martha had witnessed with the Carters, felt like almost too much happiness to hope for. But she was learning, slowly, to let herself hope anyway. As summer faded into September and the heat finally broke, Martha's body grew heavier and more unwieldy. Simple tasks became challenges. She couldn't see her own feet anymore, couldn't bend to tie her boots, couldn't sleep comfortably no matter how many pillows Samuel arranged around her. But through all the discomfort, there was joy. This was the price of the miracle growing inside her, and she paid it gladly. The community's attitude toward their marriage had softened considerably with the visible evidence of Martha's pregnancy. Even the most judgmental neighbors found it hard to maintain their disapproval in the face of an expectant mother. Women who'd been cool to Martha before now stopped by with advice and hand-me-down baby clothes, their maternal instincts overriding their moral superiority. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been among the first to gossip about the impropriety of Martha and Samuel's living arrangement, arrived one afternoon with a basket full of tiny knitted garments. "I made these for my grandchildren," she said, setting the basket on Martha's lap as she rested on the porch. "But they're all grown now, and these were just gathering dust. Thought your little one might have use for them." Martha was touched despite their complicated history. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That's very kind." "Well," the older woman said, settling into the chair beside Martha's swing, "I may have been quick to judge before, but I can admit when I'm wrong. You and Mr. Grant, Samuel, you've built something good here. Anyone can see how much he loves you, how excited he is about this baby. That counts for more than any rushed timeline." "I appreciate you saying that," Martha said quietly. Mrs. Henderson patted her hand. "Love is rare enough in this world, dear. When you find it, you hold on tight and don't let anyone tell you it's wrong just because it came at an unexpected time or in an unexpected way." After Mrs. Henderson left, Martha sat sorting through the tiny clothes, each one representing a life that would be lived, a moment that would pass too quickly. She thought about how far she'd come from the desperate, lonely woman who'd written that letter. How much had changed in the span of a single year. Samuel found her there an hour later, tears streaming down her face as she held a tiny knitted cap. "What's wrong?" he asked urgently, kneeling beside her. "Is it the baby? Are you in pain?" "No," Martha managed through her tears. "I'm just happy, so happy it hurts. Is that foolish?" Relief flooded Samuel's face. Not foolish at all. He gathered her into his arms as best he could with her belly between them. "I know exactly what you mean." They sat together as the September sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, two people who'd survived loss and loneliness now daring to embrace joy without reservation. As Martha's due date approached, Samuel became increasingly anxious. He'd sent for the midwife 3 weeks early, insisting Mrs. Thompson stay in the second new bedroom so she'd be on hand the moment Martha went into labor. The older woman, who delivered half the babies in the county, took his worry in stride with patient amusement. "First-time fathers are always the worst," she told Martha with a knowing smile. "Second time around, they're usually more relaxed, but that first baby? They're convinced something terrible is going to happen." "Can you blame him?" Martha asked. "After what happened to Catherine, no, I don't blame him one bit," Mrs. Thompson agreed. "But you're healthy and strong, and from what I can tell, this baby is positioned perfectly. Everything is going to be fine." Martha wanted to believe her, but she couldn't quite shake her own fears. Childbirth was dangerous. Every woman knew that. She'd lost friends to it, had attended funerals for mothers and babies who didn't survive. The terror of leaving Samuel widowed again, of dying before she got to hold their child, sometimes kept her awake at night. One evening in mid-October, as she and Samuel sat by the fire, Martha finally voiced her deepest fear. "If something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Samuel interrupted fiercely. "But if it does," Martha persisted, "I need you to promise me you'll be all right, that you'll take care of our baby and not let grief destroy you, that you'll let yourself love again if the opportunity comes." Samuel's face went pale. "Don't ask me to think about that. I can't. Please." Martha took his hand, holding it tight. "I need to know you'll survive. Because the thought of you alone and broken again, that's worse than my own fear of dying." "You're not going to die," Samuel said, his voice cracking. "I won't let you. I'll stand between you and death itself if I have to." "That's not how it works," Martha said gently. "But I love you for saying it." They held each other as the fire burned low, both silently praying to a God they hoped was listening, that they wouldn't be tested this way, that the happiness they'd found wouldn't be ripped away just as they'd learned to trust it. The first contractions came on a cool October morning, 10 days before Martha's calculated due date. They started as a low ache in her back, uncomfortable but manageable. Martha said nothing at first, not wanting to alarm Samuel unnecessarily. But as the morning wore on and the aches intensified into unmistakable pains, she could no longer hide what was happening. "Samuel," she called from the kitchen, where she'd been trying to prepare breakfast through increasingly frequent waves of discomfort. "I think it's time." He dropped the hammer he'd been using to make final adjustments to the cradle and was at her side in seconds, his face white with fear and excitement. "Are you sure? Should I get Mrs. Thompson? How long have you been having pains? Why didn't you say something sooner?" "Breathe," Martha told him, even as another contraction gripped her. "Yes, get Mrs. Thompson, and then maybe some water. I think this is going to take a while." Mrs. Thompson took charge immediately, her calm competence a steadying force. She examined Martha, declared everything progressing normally, and then firmly evicted Samuel from the bedroom. "You can wait downstairs," she told him. "Boil water, keep the fire going, and stay out of the way. This is women's work." Samuel looked like he wanted to argue, but Martha caught his eye and nodded. "I'll be fine. Mrs. Thompson knows what she's doing." "I'll be right downstairs if you need me," he said, squeezing her hand. "Right here, the whole time." The hours that followed were the longest of Martha's life. The contractions intensified, coming closer together, each one a wave of pain that threatened to overwhelm her. Mrs. Thompson remained calm throughout, checking Martha's progress, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. "You're doing wonderfully," she said as afternoon faded into evening. "Strong and steady. This baby is going to be here before you know it." Below they could hear Samuel pacing, his footsteps a constant rhythm against the floorboards. Every time Martha cried out, the footsteps would stop, then resume even faster. Despite the pain, Martha found herself smiling at his worry. As the sun set and the room filled with lamplight and shadows, the pains reached a crescendo that made Martha think she might actually die after all. The fear she'd tried to control came roaring back, sharp and consuming. "I can't do this," she gasped between contractions. "It's too much. I can't." "Yes, you can," Mrs. Thompson said firmly. "You are doing it. The baby's almost here, Martha. Just a little more." "Samuel!" Martha called out, needing him despite having agreed to his exile. "I need Samuel." Mrs. Thompson hesitated only a moment before opening the bedroom door and calling down. "Mr. Grant, your wife wants you." Samuel took the stairs 3 at a time, bursting into the room with wild eyes. "What's wrong? Is she—" "She's fine," Mrs. Thompson assured him. "She just needs you here. Come hold her hand, but stay out of my way." Samuel positioned himself at the head of the bed, taking Martha's hand in both of his. She gripped it hard enough to hurt, but he never flinched, never pulled away. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I'm right here, and you're going to be fine. You're the strongest person I know, Martha. You can do this." His presence made all the difference. With Samuel there, his hand in hers, his voice in her ear speaking love and encouragement, Martha found reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. When Mrs. Thompson told her to push, she bore down with everything she had. When the pain threatened to overwhelm her, she focused on Samuel's face, on the love and fear and hope written there. And then, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, there was a different kind of pain, sharp and sudden, and followed immediately by the most beautiful sound Martha had ever heard. A baby's cry, strong and indignant, filled the room. "It's a boy," Mrs. Thompson announced, her voice warm with satisfaction. "A healthy, perfect boy." Martha collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as Mrs. Thompson cleaned and wrapped the baby. Samuel's hand was still gripping hers, and when she looked up at him, she saw that he was crying too, his face transformed by wonder. "A son," he whispered. "We have a son." Mrs. Thompson placed the bundled baby in Martha's arms, and time seemed to stop. He was tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that squinted against the lamplight. His little fists waved in the air, and when Martha touched one, his fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength. "Hello, sweet boy," Martha murmured. "Hello, Nathan." They'd chosen the name weeks ago, Nathan Samuel, meaning gift of God. Looking at their son now, Martha had never felt the rightness of a name more keenly. He was a gift, this child they'd both thought they might never have. A blessing born from loss and loneliness transformed into love. Samuel reached out tentatively, his large hand looking enormous next to the baby's tiny head. "He's so small," he breathed. "So perfect." "Would you like to hold him?" Martha asked. Samuel's eyes went wide. "Can I? Is it safe?" "Of course it's safe," Mrs. Thompson said with a laugh. "He's your son, Mr. Grant. Sit down and I'll show you how." Watching Samuel hold Nathan for the first time, his strong carpenter's hands so gentle as they cradled the tiny body, Martha felt her heart expand almost painfully. This was everything she'd been afraid to hope for. A husband who loved her, a child to raise together, a future that stretched out full of possibility. Mrs. Thompson finished her work efficiently, making sure Martha was comfortable and that the baby was nursing properly. "I'll check on you both in the morning," she said, gathering her supplies. "But everything looks good. You did beautifully, Martha." After the midwife left, Samuel climbed into bed beside Martha, carefully avoiding jostling either her or the baby. They lay there together, the three of them, as night deepened outside their window. "I can't believe he's real," Samuel said softly, his finger tracing the curve of Nathan's tiny ear. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find this was all a dream." "It's real," Martha assured him. "We're real. This family we've made, it's all real." Samuel looked at her, his eyes shining with tears. "Thank you. For taking a chance on a stranger, for letting me love you, for giving me this." He gestured to encompass the baby, the room, everything they'd built together. "I never thought I'd have this again. I'd accepted that my life would be lonely and small. But you gave me everything." "You gave me everything too," Martha said. "You brought me back to life when I thought I was just going through the motions. You reminded me what it felt like to be loved, to be seen, to matter to someone." Nathan made a small sound between them, a tiny yawn that revealed pink gums, and they both laughed through their tears. "He's going to have your stubbornness," Samuel predicted. "And your tendency to worry about everything," Martha countered. "Poor kid doesn't stand a chance." They stayed awake long into the night, too enchanted by their son to sleep, watching every breath and movement with the wonder of new parents. When Nathan finally drifted off, his tiny face peaceful in sleep, Samuel carefully transferred him to the beautiful cradle he'd spent weeks carving. "Welcome home, son," he whispered, adjusting the blankets with infinite care. Martha watched from the bed, her body exhausted but her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was what she'd prayed for during that long, lonely winter when she'd written the letter she couldn't remember. This sense of completeness, of being part of something larger than herself. She'd asked for companionship and received love. She'd asked for help with the farm and received a partner for life. She'd asked for relief from loneliness and received a family. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of learning Nathan's different cries and what each one meant, of watching him grow and change with frightening speed. Samuel proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, rising without complaint for midnight feedings, walking the floor with a fussy baby so Martha could rest, changing nappies with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. Word of Nathan's birth spread quickly through the community, and suddenly their house was full of visitors bearing gifts and advice. Women who'd been suspicious of their hasty marriage now cooed over the baby, their reservations apparently forgotten in the face of new life. Even Reverend Michaels stopped by, offering somewhat grudging congratulations and a prayer for the child's health. "I suppose I owe you an apology," the Reverend said stiffly to Samuel as he prepared to leave. "I may have been hasty in my judgment of your arrangement. Clearly, God has blessed this union." "No apology necessary," Samuel said graciously, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "We know our own hearts, and that's all that matters." After the Reverend left, Martha laughed from her chair by the fire, where she sat nursing Nathan. "I think that's as close to admitting he was wrong as that man has ever come." "I'll take it," Samuel said, coming to sit beside her. He never seemed to tire of watching her nurse their son, his expression one of complete contentment. As November gave way to December and the first serious snows arrived, the Grant family settled into the rhythms of life with a new baby. Samuel continued his carpentry work, now taking commissions from neighbors who'd seen the quality of his craftsmanship in the addition he'd built. Martha gradually resumed her household tasks as her body healed, though she moved more slowly now, interrupted constantly by Nathan's needs. On Christmas Eve, they decorated the tree together, the same one they'd cut the previous year, when they'd been dancing around their feelings, too afraid to name what was growing between them. This year, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Samuel wrapped his free arm around Martha as she held Nathan, and they stood looking at the simple decorations with the satisfaction of people who'd built something real and lasting. "Last year I was falling in love with you, but too scared to admit it," Martha said softly. "This year I get to spend Christmas with my husband and son. It feels like a miracle." "It is a miracle," Samuel agreed. "The best kind. The kind that comes from choosing hope even when you're terrified." They'd invited Mrs. Henderson to join them for Christmas dinner, along with a few other neighbors who had nowhere else to go. The house rang with conversation and laughter, with the warmth of community and shared joy. As Martha watched Samuel carve the roast while holding forth about his plans for spring planting, as she saw Nathan being passed from woman to woman like a precious treasure, as she felt the happiness radiating through every corner of this house that had once echoed with loneliness, she was overwhelmed with gratitude. After their guests left and Nathan was asleep in his cradle, Martha and Samuel sat by the fire as they had so many nights before. But everything was different now. They weren't two lonely people seeking comfort. They were a family, bound by love and choice, and the daily work of building a life together. "Do you ever think about that letter?" Samuel asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "The one that started all this?" "Sometimes," Martha admitted. "I think about the woman I was when I wrote it, so desperate and broken. And then I look at who I am now, and I can barely recognize her." "She was brave," Samuel said, "braver than she knew. It takes courage to ask for help, to admit you can't do it alone." "I suppose it does." Martha leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad she was brave. I'm glad she wrote that letter, even if she immediately forgot about it and tried to send you away when you arrived." Samuel chuckled. "I'm glad I was stubborn enough to stay." "Me too." They sat in silence for a while, watching the firelight dance across the walls, listening to Nathan's soft breathing from the cradle. Finally, Samuel spoke again. "I wrote something for you, for Christmas." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "I'm not much of a writer, but I wanted you to have it." Martha unfolded the paper, her hands trembling slightly. It was a letter, written in Samuel's careful script. "My dearest Martha, a year ago, I was a broken man with nothing left to lose. I'd sold everything I owned, risked everything I had left, all because of words you'd written in a moment of desperation. When I stepped off that stagecoach and saw you standing there in the dust, I knew my life was about to change. I just didn't know how completely. You tried to send me away. I still remember the panic in your eyes when you realized what you'd done, what you'd promised without meaning to. But you were kind even in your fear. You gave me a place to stay, work to do, a chance to prove myself. You gave me dignity when I had nothing else. And slowly, day by day, you gave me something I'd thought was lost forever. Hope. Hope that life could be more than just surviving. Hope that my heart could heal and love again. Hope that two broken people could build something beautiful from their shared pain. You've given me everything, Martha. A home, a purpose, a family. But more than that, you've given me yourself. Your courage, your strength, your stubborn refusal to give up even when things seemed impossible. You've shown me what it means to be truly brave. I love you more than I have words to express. I love our son with a fierceness that sometimes frightens me. And I thank God every day for that forgotten letter, for divine providence, for whatever force brought us together against all odds. You are my answered prayer, my second chance, my proof that love can bloom even in the harshest winter. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for letting me love you. Thank you for making me a father and a husband again. Yours always, Samuel. By the time Martha finished reading, tears were streaming down her face. She folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her heart. I'm going to keep this forever, she whispered. In the box you made me, with that first letter, the one that started everything. Good, Samuel said, pulling her close. I want you to have it. Want Nathan to read it someday and know how much his parents loved each other. They kissed, slow and sweet, a reaffirmation of everything they'd promised each other. When they finally pulled apart, Martha reached for her own writing materials. Now I need to write you something, she said. You don't have to. I want to. And she did. She wanted Samuel to have words he could hold on to, proof that this was real and lasting and worth everything they'd been through to find it. She wrote quickly, her pen scratching across the paper. Dear Samuel, I don't remember writing the letter that brought you to me, but I thank God for it every day. That desperate, lonely woman knew what she needed, even when her conscious mind couldn't accept it. She knew she needed you, your strength, your kindness, your patient love that never demanded more than I could give. When you stepped off that stagecoach, I was terrified. Terrified of what your presence meant, of what I'd done, of the possibility of caring about someone and losing them again. I tried so hard to keep you at a distance, to make our arrangement purely practical. But you wouldn't let me hide. You saw through all my defenses to the frightened, grieving woman beneath, and you loved me anyway. You've given me back my life, Samuel. You've filled this house with laughter and love. You've made me a mother, given me the family I thought was impossible. But more than any of that, you've made me feel worthy of love again, worthy of happiness, worthy of a future that isn't defined by loss. I love you with my whole heart. I love the father you are to Nathan, the husband you are to me, the man you are in every moment of every day. And I promise to spend the rest of my life showing you that your leap of faith was worth it, that crossing a continent for a forgotten letter was the best decision you ever made. Thank you for being stubborn. Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me until I was brave enough to love you back. Forever yours, Martha. She handed him the letter, and they read each other's words again, memorizing them, treasuring them. These letters would become part of their family history, proof for Nathan and any children who came after him that love was worth the risk, that second chances were real, that sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as mistakes. As winter deepened and the new year began, life on the farm found its rhythm. Nathan grew and thrived, his baby smiles lighting up even the darkest January days. Samuel's carpentry business brought in steady income, supplementing what the farm provided. Martha found herself busier than she'd ever been, but it was the good kind of busy, the kind that came from a life fully lived rather than days merely survived. One snowy February morning, almost exactly a year after Samuel's arrival, Martha woke to find him already up, standing at the window looking out at the snow-covered prairie. What are you thinking about? She asked, coming to stand beside him. I'm thinking about how much can change in a year, he said, wrapping an arm around her. This time last year, I was alone in a boarding house in Helena, terrified I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. And now, he gestured around the room toward Nathan sleeping in his cradle. Now I have everything. We have everything, Martha corrected. We have everything, Samuel agreed. They stood together watching the sun rise over the prairie, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in the house, Nathan began to stir, his morning coos a signal that the day was beginning. The calf born last February, now nearly a year old herself, lowed from the barn. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying with it the smell of home and safety and belonging. Martha thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, isolated, grieving, so desperate for connection that she'd written a letter she couldn't even remember writing. That woman would be amazed to see what her moment of weakness had created, would be stunned to know that forgetting her desperate plea had been the best thing that could have happened, because it had prevented her from talking herself out of the bravest thing she'd ever done. "I'm glad I forgot," she said softly. Samuel looked down at her, puzzled. "Forgot what?" "The letter. If I'd remembered writing it, remembered that someone might actually answer, I would have panicked. Would have written to the agency to cancel it, or sent you away the moment you arrived. I would have let fear win." She turned to face him fully. "But I forgot. And because I forgot, I couldn't undo it, couldn't run from it. Had to face you and decide in that moment what to do. And even terrified, even panicking, some part of me was brave enough to let you stay." "I'm glad too," Samuel said. "Glad you forgot. Glad you let me stay. Glad for every moment that brought us to this one." Nathan's coos grew more insistent, and they both laughed. "Duty calls," Martha said, moving toward the cradle. As she lifted her son, feeling his solid weight in her arms, breathing in his baby-sweet smell, Martha sent up a prayer of thanks. For forgotten letters and stubborn men, for second chances and new beginnings, for love that found a way through loss and loneliness, for families built not on perfection, but on hope and hard work and choosing each other every single day. The prairie wind sang outside their window, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like home, like promise, like a lullaby sung over a life well lived and still unfolding, full of possibility and grace. And in the warm circle of her family, husband and son, this life she'd built from the ashes of despair, Martha Grant smiled and welcomed the day ahead, knowing that the best was yet to come.